Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Luffy fanfics, back with the amazing fanfiction. This is the second part of What if Luffy faked death using Vegapunk's time machine? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in a glorious palette available only to Mother Nature herself. A light mist clung to the surface of the ocean, giving the whole world an ethereal beauty. Seagulls cried out to each other, light and free, riding the invisible currents of the air as they soared through the sky. It was truly a glorious morning on the East Blue. Not that any of the Straw Hat Armada had the time to appreciate it. They were too busy trying not to pass out. "I don't know, but I've been told," bellowed Luffy through a megaphone from the comfort of his special seat. "I don't know, but I've been told," answered his crews, currently doing knee-highs while shadowboxing around their respective ships. "Pirates sure do love their gold. Pirates sure do love their gold. I don't know, but it's been said. I don't know, but it's been said. Pirates don't quit till they're dead. Pirates don't quit till they're dead." Peace Mains set out with a cheer. Peace Mains set out with a cheer. Unlike those ugly Morganeers. Unlike those ugly Morganeers. Those who rape and raid and kill. Those who rape and raid and kill. We're just in it for the thrill. We're just in it for the thrill. Finding One Piece is our goal. Finding One Piece is our goal. Cause freedom is good for the soul. Cause freedom is good for the soul. The one who finds it will be king. The one who finds it will be king. And kings can go do anything. And kings can go do anything. He won't forget his awesome friends. He won't forget his awesome friends. Who stuck with him until the end. Who stuck with him until the end. That's why we sail in the Armada. That's why we sail in the Armada. For our Captain Mugiwara. For our Captain Mugiwara. 1-2 sunshine. 1-2 sunshine. We go. We go. Break. Okay everybody, that's it for today. Take 5 to cool down then fall apart for messy. Or is it fall in for mess? Whatever. Good job, guys. Several men collapsed to the deck, clutching whichever cramp was burning the most. Their companions, barely better off, offered hands to help stretch out. They all looked about as threatening as sea sponges, but once they got a hot shower and an attack cuisine breakfast, they'd all be right back to being fearsome, if amicable, pirates. "That was shorter than usual," Nami commented, looking up from her compass. She'd actually had to relearn how to use one when she'd got sent back. That had been pretty funny in a backwards kind of way. "Actually," Luffy shrugged, "I just wanted to wake them up. They're going to need their energy later. You know how much trouble we got into with just 5 of us? Imagine what's going to happen with 300-odd Straw Hats wandering around Lounge Town. Do you think the chaos will be cumulative or are there economies of scale?" "I really wouldn't know," the redhead grumbled. "Will you at least promise you won't cause a scene for at least an hour? We actually do have a lot more to do this time around." "Cross my heart," Luffy swore, tracing where his scar once was. "I've got to check up on something anyway. Even then, I'll take the scenic route to the execution platform." "Why do you even have to visit that again?" Usopp asked, walking up to the bow. "It's really public and you've already done it. Couldn't we at least try to slip in and out of a place without leaving behind a trail of wreckage?" The captain huffed. "I was just a kid the last time I was up there, Usopp. I had no idea what it was like for someone that had seen the Grand Line to die looking on something so ordinary. Now that I've seen the things I've seen, it's going to be a whole new experience." Luffy quirked a brow at his sniper. "By the way, I hope it's not just our new friends that have been training. You getting any better at your observation?" Usopp looked away and rubbed his nose. "I'm fine at using it to find my targets. It's using it to do the whole mind-reading dodge thing that I'm no good at. I can't stay that calm when there's a guy an inch from my face trying to pound me." Luffy grinned. "Well, you could try what I did. Put on a blindfold and have Kaya hit you." For some inexplicable reason, Usopp was suddenly seized by a coughing fit. He probably burst a blood vessel too, because his face was suddenly red enough to be seen from space. Nami cast an eye at Kaya supervising Zoro doing some simple stretches. "It's always the quiet ones," she muttered. "Nami Swan, your breakfast is ready. I have fresh squeezed juice from your tangerines and I made marmalade from the rinds which I took the liberty to spread on your toast. I call it pain perdu alla Nami. I hope you find it especially delicious." Sanji stopped puffing smoke hearts and wiggling his legs in a way that really shouldn't be anatomically possible to resume his usual gruff demeanor. "Oi, jerks, your morning slop is ready." Zoro rolled his eyes. "Bipolar love cook," he growled. Apparently I'm considered one of the guys now. Should I perhaps take offense to that and see how he reacts?" Kaya asked, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. The swordsman grinned like a shark. "I knew there was a reason I liked you." After watching Sanji writhe a little, the crew settled down for breakfast. Meals were actually somewhat ironic affairs aboard the Going Merry. The crew, long conditioned by Luffy's thieving nature when it came to all things edible, had developed a series of strategies and methods in order to eat what they could before it vanished. However, Luffy was now the picture of table manners, courtesy of Garp's thorough if hypocritical conditioning. The result was that the majority of the crew would all keep half an eye on Luffy and flinch at his slightest twitch, eating like wolves, while the captain himself would eat sedately with his knife and fork. For Kaya, it was beyond entertaining. For the rest, it was just plain sad. Once the table was cleared, Nami pulled out a checklist. Let's go over things one more time. Usopp groaned. When did docking get so complicated? We never had to use a list before. We just winged it. Nami pierced him with a glare. Well, since a certain idiot decided to expand our operation, that's not going to work anymore. I resemble that remark, protested Luffy, patting his mouth with a napkin and not seeming aware he was doing it. Sanji Axe kicked his captain's head on principle. Continue, Nami Swan. Have I mentioned how pretty you are when you're well organized? Ignoring the second half of that, Nami examined the paper. Sanji-kun, you're to take the Barady crew and get groceries. We know Whiskey Peak is having a food shortage, and though there's lots of game on Little Garden, I'd rather we not spend too much time there. The last thing we need is another Kesha episode. Drum's still trying to find its legs again, so they won't have too much to spare. Looking up, having at some point donned reading glasses, she eyed the chef. Will 25 million buy us enough to get all the way to Arabasta? Trying to think through the Meganeko haze, Sanji did some calculations in his head. Let's see. Food for 320 active people, plus 30 cooks and 20 animals, at 3 square meals a day plus the 4th for the night shift. Enough for 3 weeks, though with uncertain whether we should have a cushion of at least a week, given the discount on bulk purchases, accounting for fishing between the islands. If we do half rations every other day, assuming no one pulls a Luffy, that should about do it. Though we'd be living off salt pork and ship biscuit by the time we dock at Nanohana. Nami nodded. Good, because that's all I'm willing to spend. Even when we're rich, we don't have enough money. Running an armada's damn expensive. First lesson in business. When is enough enough? Enough is never enough, Kaya quoted airily, reflecting on all her tutoring sessions with her late father. Nami went on. I don't want to risk drawing smokers' attention, so Jin and the Dawn crew can't just steal a ship. Thankfully, I heard the shipyard there's struggling ever since all the pirate customers stopped appearing. They should be able to get a pretty good deal. Usopp, your job is to do whatever the heck it is you do to get what you need for your lab. Luffy's training can only go so far. If we're to keep all the grunts from cannon fodder status, they're going to need some quality liar's tricks up their sleeves. Plus, I'm sure all the other captains and officers are going to need their weapons upgraded sooner or later. Usopp puffed his chest. Just leave it to me. I'm the king of flea markets and junk shops. Why, I once made a particle accelerator with just some copper wire and a 4-piece toaster oven I got for just tuning out the jibber-jabber of the fellow member of the weakling trio. Nami moved on. Kaya, Kadu, and I are going clothes shopping after I run a little errand with Django. Everyone else is free to do their own thing, provided they keep their cover until Luffy starts to blow things up. Though I'm tempted to give Zoro an escort so he doesn't get lost, she tacked on with a straight face. I don't get lost. Everything else just moves when I'm not looking, Zoro huffed, tilting his new hat. Sanji drawled. Shut up, cook. I'm not done. Height. Luffy chuckled. Well, that's settled. One last stop before the Grand Line, guys. So let's get this show on. He trailed off, his mouth going slack. His eye grew to the size of saucers while his pupils reduced to the size of pinpricks. His normal healthy tan rapidly paled, first to the color of bad porridge, then to chalk, before settling on ghostly ivory. His body suddenly started shaking, as if coming down from an adrenaline high, or perhaps having a mild seizure. Alarmed, the crew rose. Luffy, what is it? Questioned Nami. For a second, he didn't move. Then he seemed to jerk, as if struck from a trance. With shocking speed, he made for the furthest corner of the room, where he proceeded to curl into a ball and start shivering as if he was out in a blizzard. Now very creeped out, the crew exchanged looks. Kaya, suddenly the picture of non-threatening gentleness, held up her hands and slowly inched toward her captain, as if approaching a spooked animal. Luffy-san, is something the matter? She purred in a tune as soothing as a lullaby. The man-child's only response was a tiny moan. Slowly kneeling, Kaya got on eye level with Luffy. If you don't tell us what's wrong, we can't help you, she coaxed. Luffy took a huge breath, so much that his sides expanded, before letting it out in a shuddering gasp. He's here, rasped Luffy, sounding like he was speaking from his own grave. Who's here? Kaya asked, softly as a kitten's fur. Gramps, he's here. And he's pissed, Luffy hissed. Kaya smiled gently. Okay, why does that affect you so much? You don't get it, Luffy snarled. Gramps is pissed. He'll look for us, and he'll find us, and when he does he's going to destroy us all. Luffy had started out barely above a whisper, but ended screaming at the top of his lungs. Kaya didn't outwardly react. Luffy-san, I'm sure you're overreacting. Destroy us all. Destroy us all. Destroy us all. destroyed us all. Luffy roared like a broken record, her face still angelic in its serene calm. Kaya pulled back her hand and slapped Luffy so hard that his head turned around a few times. Please don't interrupt me when I'm comforting you, she chided. When Luffy's head settled back in its proper alignment, he took a couple breaths. His shaking had stopped. Thanks, Kaya. I needed that. Happy to help, she chirped. She stood back up and waltzed over to Usopp's side. She either didn't notice or didn't care how her other three Nakama all leaned away from her. What did you think of my bedside manner, Usopp-kun? Usopp was either a much better actor than he let on or he truly didn't fear his girlfriend at all. You're a natural, Kaya-chan. Chopper will be lucky to have you as a nurse. Aw, Gatsby, Kaya simpered, blinking doe eyes up at the sniper as she cuddled up closer, filtering out the weirdness for the sake of her sanity, a skill she was unfortunately very practiced at. Nami got back on topic. Luffy, what the hell was that? Why are you this freaked out about your grandpa being at Logtown? Luffy, though no longer in a blind panic, turned a bit blue at Nami's words. I was hoping I wouldn't have to see him until Water 7, if then. I thought they'd send some backup with my higher bounty, but I never thought that Gramps would be this close. Shit, this is so bad. Sanji resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Why are you this freaked out? We've run into your grandpa before and walked away pretty okay. Like an extraterrestrial parasitic larva, Luffy launched at Sanji's face and latched on. You sir headman. Last time, I didn't trick him. Every damn time he saw me, I was shouting to the rooftops how I would never ever be a Marine and was going to be Pirate King if it killed me. When I actually followed through, it was a disappointment but no big surprise. When he came to Water 7, that was him checking up on family. And at Marineford, he let me hit him so he could fake defeat and give himself an out. This time, he's mad as fuck. This time, he thinks I've betrayed him. This time, he's actually going to fight. Usopp was getting a sinking feeling. Still, he tried to convince Luffy and himself that there was nothing wrong. Come on, Luffy. You can take on that old man. Didn't you say you could take on an admiral and win? Luffy detached from Sanji only to swivel toward Usopp. If Kaya hadn't been there, he'd probably have given his sniper the same face-to-face screaming treatment. An admiral? Sure, I can take on one lousy admiral. That's peanuts compared to taking on my freaking grandpa. He's old school. He's up there with the Yonko. If you asked me to bet between him and old man Whitebeard, I'd have to flip a coin. And remember, Gramps doesn't have a devil fruit. He doesn't have some special weapon and he doesn't have any creature blood-lending advantages. He's just a plain, old, vanilla human being with nothing but Haki and his fists. And he still was to Roger what Smokey ended up being to me. Think about that. What does that tell you about him? There was dead silence as the reality of Luffy's words and blind fear started to sink in. Zoro, stoic as always, HMM'd, must be one hell of a fist. Luffy seemed ready to swallow his tongue. You have no idea. If you told me he tunneled through the red line with his bare hands, I'd believe you. According to Old Man Chinjao, Gramps leveled 8 mountains to warm up for their fight. That's what's waiting for us. And I can feel just how spitting mad he is all the way from here. Wiping the spit off his face with a fresh silk handkerchief, Sanji recovered from Luffy's attack. Curious, and more than a little apprehensive, he cast his gaze inward on the sixth sense that was observation and tried to sense what had set his captain off. Rage H8FRE treachery agony LOS's free NZY vengeance. There are no words to describe the aura emanating from Logtown. It was like a wounded animal, torn up and bleeding and mad with pain. It was also a fallen ruler, betrayed by his closest friend, his family, stabbed in the back and the knife twisted. And it was a hurricane, a typhoon, a storm of screaming wind and freezing rain and pounding waves, a massive elemental chaos determined to level all in its path to satisfy its wrath. Such was the mood of the earthbound god that was Vice Admiral Monkey D. Garp the Fist, hero of the Marines. Sanji opened his eyes to find himself flat on the floor. Around his screaming self-preservation instincts, he wasn't surprised. If anything, he was amazed he only got away with being knocked on his ass. Oh, Luffy, Sanji moaned, getting to his feet before the confused eyes of his Nakama. What have you done? The young king to be gulped, seeing the echo of his own fear in his cook's eyes. What I had to do. It was the only way I had to get to where I had to be. I was just banking on him having a couple months to cool off, trying and failing to pull off his usual nonchalant grin. Luffy added, I do have a plan, though. Pray tell, Nami asked, moving over to the trembling Sanji. In a rare bout of kindness, she placed a hand on his shoulder to try and comfort him. Such was his condition that he didn't even perv out at the touch. He just reached up to lay his hand over hers. He still shook. Luffy laughed half-heartedly. Well, you see, Gramps is mad because he thinks I broke my promise to be a Marine. The thing is, I never actually said that I would. I just asked him to make me strong and made puppy eyes until he said yes. Anything else is just his own assumptions. When I tell him that, he'll realize that it's all his own fault and he has no reason to take it out on me. Simple as that. Isn't that great? Zoro gave Luffy a flat stare. Luffy, do you remember Whiskey Peak? Luffy frowned. Of course I do. Do you remember trying to kill me because you thought I had slaughtered the generous townspeople in cold blood? Suddenly finding the corner of the room extremely interesting, Luffy answered, yes. Do you remember me trying to explain that they were really bounty hunters trying to catch us in a trap? You know, it was years ago. The memories are all kind of fuzzy. Do you remember countering with, and I'm quoting here, enemies don't give you food? I may have said that. Shoot, I say a lot of things. Do you remember your grandpa blurting out who your father was before he remembered it was supposed to be a secret at Water 7? That does sound like him, Luffy mumbled, by now squirming like there were squids copulating in his shorts. Do you remember Aokiji saying that you and your grandpa are a lot alike? Luffy didn't even respond. Zoro waited a beat. Finally, he asked, do you really think your grandpa will let you off on a technicality? Mumble wumble. Luffy dithered. When he ran out of delaying sounds, he hung his head. I can dream, can't I? He muttered, suddenly at the center of his own dark cloud. Zoro quirked his lips. I'll take that as a no. Nami sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Someone please tell me that we're not totally fucked. I don't even care if you're lying. I just need to hear it. Kaya spoke up. You know, Luffy-san, my father had a saying. He was talking about business, but I think it applies here. It was hope for the best, plan for the worst. Now, your grandfather just might forgive you when you explain. But just in case he doesn't, we need to know what to do. Luffy wallowed for a moment longer. Then he got up and sat down back at his chair. Usopp, could you be a dear and hit me in the head with a hammer? The liar tilted his head. You sure? Captain's orders. Well, if you insist. With some hesitance, Usopp walked up to his captain while rifling around his bag. Taking a breath, Usopp reared back and yelled, Usopp hammer. A goose egg raised on Luffy's head as Usopp lifted the mallet off of his skull. Raising a hand, Luffy scratched the bump like he would the side of his head. He scrunched up his face, steam practically coming out his ears. After a minute of pondering, he put a finger on the protrusion and pushed it back into his skull. That done, Luffy stood up. I have 12% of a plan. Nami resisted the urge to bang her head on the table. Zoro shrugged. Better than 11%. Let's hear it. The Armada docked within the hour. Well, docked might not be the proper verb. They didn't sail into the official port and weigh anchor with all the reputable ships. Even original Luffy wasn't stupid enough to sail into a town with a known marine presence with skull and crossbones flying. Well, he did it because pirates don't dock with the boring people, but still. Rather, the 4 ships found some nice rocks a good 2 miles away from town. It was organized chaos as the crews disembarked, save for the unlucky few that had drawn short straws on guard duty. Those were currently getting treated to a motivating talk from a strangely subdued Luffy about how the safety of their ships, their homes, their inanimate friends rested on their shoulders. They all seemed strangely proud of being stuck with the boring job by the time their captain was done. Usopp was calling out orders through the megaphone, standing up on a nearby crate. No shoving. Find your assigned groups and we'll get through this with as little frustration as possible. Cloaks are being passed around by Buggy. Find the nearest limb and collect your own in an orderly fashion. Personal allowance is being distributed by Nami. If she doesn't let go right away, then gently get her attention. Don't try to initiate a tug of war. That just sets her off. Be sure to set out with at least a 5-minute cushion since the last group. We don't want to be too suspicious. Remember, all units are to report to the town square by the time the storm hits, so make getting your supplies first priority. And smile. It's not every day you set out for the Grand Line. Nami was openly weeping as she got to Jin. Okay, here's the funds for your new ship, she said to him, holding a money bag like it was her firstborn. His name is Marvin. If he gets fussy, just say some rhymes with a funny face. Be sure to spend him before sundown. He doesn't like to meet strangers when it's dark. Jin hid his sweat drop. Right, I'll just take Marvin off your hands. Take him off my hands. Yep, she said faintly, not moving. You can just hand him over. Hand him over. Right. Ready to receive him. Nami sobbed, but finally relinquished the sack. Jin had to hide the twitch in his muscles as he struggled under the weight. For a self-proclaimed weak little girl, she sure had a strong pair of biceps. Ordeal done. Nami turned to her personal sack of money. Don't worry, Daisy. I'll never give you away. I'll be holding on to you forever. And when I die and become a skeleton, I'll still be holding you, yes. She cooed. Something is seriously wrong with that chick, muttered Gaiman, looking up from where he was arranging the pets into their guard formation. Between Richie and Momo as role models, even the Baraf, arguably the cutest, looked threatening. Anyone who assumed the animals were just for show was in for the stampede from hell on an acid trip. Zoro slid to Luffy's side after Kaya had finished giving him a 15-minute lecture on what he could and could not do, reminding him no swords. Hey, Luffy, what's going on with you? Your aura is all wonky. Luffy looked like he had to fight to get each word through the manic concentration that clouded his features. Camouflage. For Gramps. First, toned down voice. Then blend with surroundings. Very hard. Please stop talking. Zoro just sighed and wandered off. He didn't have a clear destination. He just knew that he didn't want to run into that Kuno look-alike. Even with his dream accomplished and her spirit laid to rest, he was sure that woman would make him all kinds of uncomfortable. Therefore, he was determined to avoid her. Naturally, she was the first thing he ran into. But more on that later. Sanji finished his cigarette, took a minute to ogle Nami, bent over counting her money, and turned to the Bear-80 crew. Okay, morons. Time to get provisions. Don't let yourselves get scalped by the fishmongers. Shut up, Sanji. We can shop just fine. Groused Patty. The former Suze raised a brow. Really? Because as I recall, when I took over for you on stocking the restaurant, our profits nearly doubled. How much money were you costing us with your shitty haggling skills, Patty? Less than you did with constantly updating your wardrobe. I could bathe in caviar for the amount you spent on shoes. Eggplant, Zeph huffed. Sanji flushed to the roots of his hair. You're one to talk, shitty geezer. How much does that special shampoo you use for your mustache cost us each month? About half as much as your cigarettes, brat. With how many cartons you go through in a week, I'm surprised we didn't go out of business. Oh, please. How much did that hatter charge you to commission that ridiculous toque of yours? Karn sighed with his fellow cooks as they followed the two bickering blondes towards Logtown. This could go on for days. Django shuffled as he stood next to Kadu. So, what's this thing Nami wants me to help you girls with? No idea. I don't bother asking that woman questions. It's better to just go with it and not get charged the detail tax, shrugged the Harlequin. The hypnotist coughed and subtly checked his breath. You know, Kadu, I've always thought that you were, a lovely girl. What about the ruddy Earl? She asked, tilting her head. I mean, a vision of beauty. Panicked the man, fishin' for duty. What kind of sicko are you? She exclaimed. No, that's not what I mean, you heard wrong. No, oh fuck it. When I say 1, 2, Django, you'll forget the last minute. 1, 2, Django. The disco enthusiast waited for the vacant expression to leave the girl's eyes before trying again. So, nice weather we're having, right? Siam and Butch Eye watched from the side with pity. That's the third time today. You think the captain's ever gonna get it right? Asked the slim one. I hope so. At this rate, the poor girl's going to be eating meals with a straw before he seals the deal, mused the large one. Kabaji sighed as he witnessed all the idiosyncrasies of the armada. Could this group get any stranger? He asked his companion as he witnessed his captain chew out a Don for accidentally tickling his armpit while grabbing his coat. Moji looked up from braiding Richie's mane. Not unless we got an amorphous white creature that morphs into a sword with AD and OCD that was simultaneously so powerful it disrupts the very fabric of reality and so annoying it could make even the sun grimace. Kabaji leaned away a bit. You've got to stop hanging out with Usopp-sama. Your hypotheticals are getting ridiculous. High above them, the sun grew spikes in a face, winked at the audience, and returned to being an ordinary ball of yellow flame. Finally, everything was sorted out, and the Straw Hat Armada set out to take Logtown by storm. Nami pulled back the dressing room curtain, revealing that she was in a drop-dead cocktail dress with a stuffed fox as a scarf. What do you think of this? She asked. Effervescent, miss, gushed the teller, who was apparently so committed to the trade of clothes that he'd gone to the trouble of growing his hair in the shape of a hanger. How about this? Kai asked, showing off a ball gown of conservative cut, but made of lace so translucent it bordered on indecent. Oh, electric, miss. He simpered. What about me? Challenged Kadu, sporting a boho dress of eye-searing kaleidoscopic color. Eccentric, miss, he managed, his fake smile perfectly intact. And this? Nami asked, already changed into a cowgirl outfit straight out of a farmhand's wet dream. Elegant, miss. The girls continued to try on half the store, with the attendant continuing to shower praise such as elemental and elegy. Guess he had a thing for words that start with E. The man was almost drooling as he watched the pile on the checkout stand grow, mentally calculating how big his commission would be. When all three were back in their original clothes, he stepped forward. So, will you be taking all of them? Nami smiled sweetly as she led the three of them out. Nope, we're looking for something more casual. Please come again soon. He shouted after them, crying rivers as his dreams of early retirement went up in smoke. The girls chatted as girls are wont to do as they searched for their next hunting ground. Man, that guy was pathetic. Was I the only one getting a creeper vibe off him? He probably collects all the underwear girls leave in the rooms, groused Nami. I'll give him one thing, he's committed to the sale. I was looking for a thesaurus when he was buttering us up, Kaya commented. None of that stuff was good for life on a ship. Man, is it too much to ask for a pirate couture boutique or something? Kadu whined. They'd get shut down by the government in a Mariewa minute. So yeah, sighed Nami. The closest we'd get is a costume shop. Actually, why don't we try that? You can look for a salty wench's outfit and I can look for a few possibilities for the next time Usopp-kun and I have story time, offered Kaya, hiding a mild nosebleed. Hate to interrupt this riveting conversation, spoke up Django, who'd been lagging behind them under the weight of numerous bags. But why am I here exactly? Nami rolled her eyes. To be our pack mule, of course. You should be honored. Honored, my left nut. I already ran that little errand for you. Why do I have to suffer this kind of torture? The hypnotist protested. Nami's eyes turned to blurry symbols as her eyes landed on the two stuffed duffel bags hanging off Django's shoulders. That had been the easiest heist of her life. She'd had Django accompany her to the biggest bank in Logtown, where she'd had him hypnotize the teller into emptying the vault. All the others just assumed that he was some out-of-town business tycoon out for a day with his sugar baby. 500 million in 5 minutes, a new record. She thought there was a beautiful friendship in store for her and Django. Yes, her code used to be she only stole from pirates, but the Armada needed funds. There were a lot more of them this time around, but Nami would always put her nakama first, provided she got a little something out of the deal too. Plus the bank was probably insured and the world government would have to make up the funds. As far as Luffy was concerned, anything that caused those bastards a headache was time well spent, and Nami was happy to help. She was brought back to reality by a piteous whine. There go my knees. Oh, my arms. I'm gonna get crushed. I'm gonna get smeared like a puddle over all your clothes. How would you princesses feel about that? I'll brew you some willow bark tea later. Now shut up. Take it like a man, barked Kadu. Sure, whatever you say, mumbled Django, defeated by his crush's command. Kaya smirked. Another opportunity to stretch her yenta muscles. Should be easier than Operation Swirly Pinwheel. Those two were hopeless. Speaking up, she said, Oh honey, ignore the little man and let's find you some quality makeup. Your color palette is way out of alignment. So is my spine, moaned the poor man stuck with them. Nami chuckled, but then she looked towards the harbor with a frown. Vice Admiral Garp's ship was on proud display. She hoped Luffy managed to keep his cover. Wouldn't do for them to get caught until they wanted to. Nami, come in here. This lip gloss is amazing. Where? She cried, setting thoughts of the crew's survival aside for a much more important matter, fashion, or one to trace Luffy's path through Logtown. They might well think that he was being led by a member of the Hibiki clan. In a mere 15 minutes, he had circled the town once, turned back on himself thrice, jumped over 2 buildings, and taken at least 1 detour through a sewer. However, there was a method to his madness. Garp apparently wasn't taking any chances. Not only was the man himself wandering around the place like a cat searching for a mouse, but he'd stationed Marines at all major junctions and had the rest randomly patrolling. Luffy felt like he was playing a horrifically one-sided game of cops and robbers. The whole experience was made just that much harder by the constant colossal concentration needed to hide his aura. Otherwise, Garp would just hone in on him like a rat to cheese. Imagine simultaneously running a marathon and doing calculus through a war zone, with your mother-in-law yelling at you while riding on your shoulders, plus a bull charging at you from behind, and you have to go to the bathroom on a worldwide broadcast. It wasn't easy. To help, he was repeating a mantra that Garp himself had taught him to help with the stealth side of observation. I am the walls and the floors and air. I am everything and I am nothing. I'm not there. Luffy was currently blending in with a passing group down one of the city's many market streets. The trick was to move like them. Luffy was eyeing the pair of petty officers at the upcoming intersection, hoping that they were too bored to actually be scouting, when he felt himself being jerked by a massive hand into an alley. Luffy had his thumb in his mouth and was halfway through blowing before he realized that the hand had red fingernail polish on the nails. And while Garp had developed a sweet tooth over the years, he was still quite fit and definitely not wider than he was tall. The hand let go and Luffy looked up into the face of the first woman he'd ever hit. Ah, Alvida, fancy meeting you here. One look was all it took to see this was a very different Alvida than the one Luffy had ran into in the alternate timeline. For one thing, she was still roughly the size of an adolescent elephant. For another, there was no haughty smirk on her lips. Before and after her transformation, Alvida had always carried herself with a casual arrogance, a certainty that she was the most significant being for a mile in any direction. There was none of that now. In fact, her shoulders were hunched, her face slack with calm, her eyes wide and earnest. The image of a puppy flashed through Luffy's head. Looks like that experiment worked out. Let's see where this goes, mused Luffy. The extra-large woman weakly smiled. I've been looking for you, Straw Hat, ever since that day. Why? Revenge, perhaps? Luffy asked, noting that she'd replaced her club with a solid steel kanabo. She shook her head so fast her neck rolls did the wave. No way. I actually wanted to thank you. Thank me? For what? Luffy asked. To be honest, he'd barely remembered Alvida. She was just a test to see if careful application of conquerors could really profoundly change someone's personality, as his Gramps had so sternly warned him never to do. Reverse psychology, really? Alvida gulped. Look, I know what kind of person I was. I was cruel, I was petty, and my temper was a tripwire. I guess it goes back to my childhood. Everyone teased me for my weight. I ate because I was unhappy. and I was unhappy because I ate. It was a vicious cycle. Eventually, I decided to fight fire with fire and be mean right back. From there, I guess I got carried away. Before you know it, I was head of my own pirate crew, looting and pillaging and insisting on this fantasy that I was actually beautiful. To be honest, I was probably so vicious because deep down, I hated myself. But I was trapped in this situation I'd built myself. Then Alvida's eyes lit up. Then you showed up. Your words were harsh, but they were true. And then you hit me. The woman moved a hand to rub her tummy. No one had ever done that to me. It changed me. It was like you literally knocked some sense into me. When I landed in the ocean, all alone, all I could do was think about what you said, how bad things happen to bad people. Luffy tried very hard to look like he was listening. Though to be honest, he could barely hear her through his mental decathlon. I'm not sure how, but I managed to swim to shore. I was so hungry. Then I came upon this fisherman who was having trouble with his nets. I thought about just stealing them from him, like I was used to, when your words flashed through my mind. So instead, I offered my help. And you know what? He offered me a few. He even cooked them for me. I could hardly believe it. I always thought people were inherently selfish and anything you wanted in this world, you had to take. Yet here was this man giving me fish. Later, I was walking down the road, looking for a town. I passed this wagon, full of hay. This guy was scratching his head, shouting at the broken wheel like he thought that would fix it. I could have just passed him and minded my own business. The old me would have. But instead, I lifted up the wagon so he could replace the wheel. He was gushing. He was so happy. He even tossed out a bough so I'd have a spot to sit. Just like that, he was offering me a ride. I was amazed at how trusting he was. I used to think that kindness was weakness, but seeing that man be so nice to a stranger, I now see it takes a strength I never knew. Luffy nodded, in his head watching a cartoon Alvida act out the adventures her real counterpart was describing. Finally, I got to a town. I snuck around, because I didn't want to get noticed by the Marines. I just got to the pier when I heard this ruckus. It turned out that some punks were trying to mug some merchant that had just sailed in. I remember being scared, deciding I shouldn't interfere. But then I saw your face in my mind, and I realized that not doing anything is as bad as doing it yourself when you have the chance to help, and I didn't want to be bad anymore. So, I charged in. They actually ran away the second they saw me. I didn't even have to fight. Still, that was the hardest choice I ever had to make. And then the guy was so grateful, he gave me the very thing he'd been protecting. With reverent movements, Alvida reached into her pocket and pulled out what looked like an avocado. A pink avocado, with very swirly skin. Luffy's eyes widened. He'd never actually been this close to another devil fruit. Not since he'd ate his. Something inside him seemed to shy away from it. Some instinctive fear activating at the presence of the innocuous foodstuff. Alvida held it out in a gesture of supplication, even getting down on one knee. This is my offering to you, Monkey D. Luffy. With one punch and a few words, you changed my life. You made me a better person. And I want to keep changing. I want to become someone who can look herself in the mirror. If you will have me, I want to be with you. Your enemies would be my enemies. Your challenges my challenges. Help me be better, and I will do anything you ask. Luffy gulped. This was actually a bit scary. Sure, it had pretty much worked out for the better, but one sentence and a dash of conquerors, and he'd remade an entire personality. He'd have to be much more careful about this. Maybe there was a reason the world government was so scared he had this power. Refocusing on the present, Luffy picked up the fruit. A brief whisper from the voice confirmed that it was the same one Alvida had found in another life. With a nod, he held it out to Alvida, who looked up in shock. This is the sub no mai. It gives the eater incredibly smooth skin, to the point where attacks just slide off. A very useful power, and quite dangerous in the wrong hands. Luffy grinned his trademark grin at Alvida. If you want to be my nakama, this will probably come in handy. Alvida gulped. So, if I eat this, you'll let me sail with you? Alvida had her doubts. She was determined to do what it took to be with her savior. But was it worth becoming a hammer, doomed to drown at the slightest opportunity? To say nothing of becoming responsible for some strange, mysterious power. Alvida's racing thoughts were stopped by Luffy's snort. No, silly. You can do that anyway. I just thought you might want it. If you want, you can sell it or just throw it away. It's yours, after all. Alvida smiled. That was why she would do it. That simple, unthinking goodness. She wanted to be near it. She wanted to learn it. And she hoped, one day, she could find it within herself. Without thinking twice, Alvida grabbed the fruit from her captain's hand and tossed it in her mouth. A few chews and a swallow, and it was done. Then the flavor processed. The obese woman all but gagged. Nasty, she cried, trying to think through the overpowering sense of each and every taste bud, screaming this is what evil tastes like. As they died a slow and painful death, Luffy giggled. Shishishishi, forgot to warn you about that. A flash of concern went over his features. I don't know if this next part will hurt or not. Sorry if it does. Before Alvida could ask, she was hit by the single weirdest feeling of her life. Every cell in her body started to tingle as if they each had pounded a six-pack of Red Bull. Her bones suddenly started to protest as what felt like a whole puberty's worth of growth spurts was shoved into a few seconds, while everything else felt like it was getting sucked into some central point. As fast as it hit, it was over. Alvida reached out a hand to steady herself, her balance feeling quite wonky, but it slid against the stone as if greased with butter. She staggered to recover her balance and became aware of a curious breeze around her legs. Looking down, she was confused to see that her shirt had seemed to grow until it looked like she was wearing a tent while her pants and shoes seemed to have just fallen off her. She looked up, hoping for an explanation from the object of her devotion, only to pause. "How'd you get so tall?" she asked, and reached up a hand to rub her throat. Did her voice sound different? Luffy shrugged, that damnable grin still on his face. "I didn't grow. You just got smaller." Before she could respond to that, all the blood drained from the young pirate's face faster than if someone had slit his throat. "I smell cigar smoke on the air. The reckoning is upon us." He shoved something into her hand. "Here's money for clothes. The ships are a walk along the coast with the sea on your right. The password is meat. I must away." Moving so quick he left an afterimage. The Armada captain sprinted down the alley and out of sight. Alvida stared into the alley's depths, feeling as puzzled as she'd ever felt when she heard someone cough behind her. Bam! Alvida turned, seeing that it was some random marine, a cigarillo poking out the side of his mouth. She tensed, fearing recognition, only to watch bemusedly as the guy started to drool and hearts replace his eyes. Stepping around the odd man, hoping he wasn't some creeper, Alvida walked into the street. She jerked to a stop as everyone turned to look at her. As one, men and women started to gawp at her as if she were some kind of celebrity. More than a little freaked out, trying to ignore the mumbling, Alvida slipped into the nearest clothing shop. She immediately made for the biggest clothes, reaching out for what caught her eye. She paused when she saw that her usual size seemed much too big. Confused as all get out, Alvida made for the dressing room. After locking the door behind her, she turned to look in the provided mirror, and gasped. Her whole body slid out of the neck hole of the shirt like she was slicked with cooking oil. She didn't notice. She was too consumed by the goddess in the mirror. Thick, wavy locks, cute, button nose, taut, round buttocks. Everything men lusted after and women pined for was there, as if some god was working through a checklist. Full, bouncy tits, check. Svelte, hourglass figure, check. Legs that went for miles, smooth and creamy and hairless, check. She was a new woman. For the first time in her life, she truly was beautiful, like she'd always wanted. And also for the first time, she didn't feel like hearing others say it. Alvida chuckled as she ran a hand over her silky cheeks. Figures. She got everything she ever wanted, just in time for it to not matter. If there was one thing she'd learned in the months since her world had turned upside down, it was that it was what was on the inside that counted. Even if she looked like this when she met Luffy, she still would have been a terrible person. Sure, some shallow part of her was rejoicing like there was no tomorrow. But now, all she cared about was being a good person, following the example of a good man she'd just pledged herself to. Her newfound beauty didn't matter. Quickly finding out her new measurements, Alvida stepped out of the shop properly clothed. Retrieving her kanabo from where she'd forgotten it, she made her way to the coast. Along the way, she marveled at the smoothness of her skin. Unless she gripped it properly, the spiked staff slid through her fingers like water. Curious, she ran a finger over one of the barbs, and her finger didn't even get cut. Luffy was right, this was going to be useful. She then tripped and slid on her exposed stomach for a good spear's throw until she ran into some stacked crate. Well, it was going to take some getting used to. Walking along the coast, she passed a couple of stacked boulders only to come upon 4 docked ships. 3 of them had a very familiar hat on their Jolly Rogers. Alvida walked up, looking for someone, only to pause as what looked like a snake with fur and rabbit ears reared up and hissed at her. "Halt, who goes there?" shouted what looked like a bush. Alvida turned to look, and noticed a few heads peeking over the lips of the ships. All of them seemed to have the same gobsmacked, dazed look in their eyes. Alvida couldn't tell if that was flattering or annoying. Turning her attention to the bush, she decided to fall back on what Luffy told her. I have the password." The bush looked up, revealing some kind of caveman stuck in some kind of box. Alvida held her tongue. Who was she to critique appearances? Half an hour ago, she looked like an upright walrus. What is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? The bush asked with utmost solemnity, feeling a bit silly. Hoping Luffy hadn't had his wires crossed when he'd left in such a hurry, Alvida answered. "Meat." The man nodded. "You may pass. May I ask what you're doing here?" Alvida smiled kindly. "Luffy-sama let me join the crew." "What, you mean she's our nakama? We get to see her every day," yelled one of the men who suddenly appeared on the deck of the cat-themed ship. "Captain Luffy is just the best," proclaimed a clown whose eyes were definitely not looking at her face. A man in a chef's uniform walked up to her, looking not all there. "Oh hello Papa Jaina, Tulipea Kona Papaya." Alvida sighed as her new crewmates continued to be dazzled into stupidity. This was definitely going to take some getting used to. Jin took a moment to admire the architecture of the street he was walking on. This was his first time visiting Logtown. Krieg had declined to stock up here, claiming that I already have everything I need to conquer the Grand Line. Looking back, he was probably just too chicken to risk facing the White Hunter, the mysterious new Marine captain that had cracked down hard on pirates in the town. Jin let out a sigh. For all his destructive power, Krieg really had been just a coward. How had Jin ever followed a man like that? Well, as they say, hindsight was 20/20. The new captain looked over his shoulder at his crew. On second thought, a bunch of guys covered in cloaks really wasn't that much less suspicious than a bunch of guys in worn clothing and obviously armed. But then again, whereas the latter was almost immediately profiled as pirate by passerby, the former merely earned cautious sidelong glances. Jin was pretty sure they'd been made by at least a dozen townsfolk on their way to the docks. But those who'd gotten that gleam in their eye had just shrugged and carried about their business. Who cares if you passed a pirate? They weren't bothering you, so just let them go. Sure, they'd probably hurt or rob someone else, but that wasn't your problem, right? Many people who are just learning about the criminal underworld become convinced that there must be some grand conspiracy in place in order to keep it all hidden and uninvestigated. But the truth is, not many people care. Because, unless something goes down right in front of you, until something happens to you or someone you care about, you're not involved. So what if people are waiting outside your neighbor's door day and night? You don't know they're a drug dealer, and that restaurant might be the one good spot in a bad neighborhood. But that doesn't mean it's backed by the mob. It's not worth the trouble to try and make any waves. Just keep your head down and keep moving. Society's biggest problem isn't greed or violence. It's sloth, apathy. The world could be burning down around them, and most would just stick their heads in the sand. Jin shook his head. Now wasn't the time to get lost in philosophic thought. The Dawn had charged him with a task, and he was going to complete it with the utmost effort and total focus. The disguised Dawn crew got up to the last marine checkpoint before the shipyards. "State your destination," droned the uniformed grunt, who looked so bored he might have been in danger of falling asleep standing up. "The shipyard. We need to purchase a ship," said Pearl, speaking in place of Jin so they wouldn't give the newly infamous face too much of a look. "Proceed," the Marine stated, not seeming like he heard a word. "Wait," shouted his companion, who looked so jittery he might fire his musket by accident. "Why are you all wearing those cloaks? Got something to hide?" Pearl kept his cool and gave the guy a look. Jin was struck by the odd thought of how different he looked when he wasn't wearing his helmet and his hair was down. "Relax, officer. We just heard it was going to rain later." The kid couldn't have been wearing the uniform longer than a month. Let out an audible gasp of relief. "Oh, that's all. Sorry for the trouble. Enjoy your day." As they shuffled past, the pirate right next to Jin whispered, "How the hell does that weak-ass excuse keep working?" Jin shrugged. "These guys are looking for the Dawn. Not us. They're not going to follow up on every creepy-looking person when the highest bounty in this part of the world is wandering around. Don't jinx it, Juan." "Sorry, Cap," muttered the exposition peon, his purpose served and likely never to be noticed again. The disguised crew made their way into the surprisingly quiet ship repair area. Violent as pirates were portrayed by the media, the damage was usually confined to flesh and blood instead of wood and cloth. In a confrontation, a vessel either quietly surrendered and got off with little more than a few scratches or valiantly put up a fight and got the classic powder magazine package to the Davy Jones junkyard, unless you were lucky enough for the Marines to intervene. And then you didn't get your repairs done at a private yard. Oh no, you got escorted to the nearest base and got treated by the best carpenters the world government could afford. And to compensate you for your time and to just take a load off your terrorized little shoulders, the Marines would even take over the job of transporting any cargo you had on you. So you had one less thing to worry about. And if they maybe took a bit of the profits from the sale, well, think of that as a head start on your taxes. And if there always seemed to be less cargo at arrival than when the ship set out, well, what puny merchant had the balls to accuse the world government of theft? Point being, age of pirates or no, the ship repair business in Logtown wasn't lucrative. Jin spotted a group of 4 ships all bearing the flag of the Eurus League. The company their own Kaya had abdicated in favor of following her boyfriend out to sea, in for what looked like a gale. And there was one yacht that, from what the Dawn captain could tell, looked like some idiot that had no business owning a swivel gun had won too many drinks and spotted a rat on deck. Considering the max capacity was 24 ships of the line, they weren't exactly pressed for room. One of the workers looked up from lying on a pile of rope, literally with nothing better to do. "Can I help you, strangers?" Pearl spoke up. "Yes, where are the ships for purchase?" The guy tugged at a strand of hair that seemed permanently glued together by dried salt. "Depends on what you're looking for. Rafts, dinghies and such, you can always count on Holt and Sons. For fishing, you go to Angie's Anglers. You don't mind selling an arm and a leg for too little hold room. You can get a decent merchant vessel from Peterman & Co." Jin spoke up. "And if we were in need of something with a little Firepower. The dockhand raised a brow and seemed to give their little group a second look. Jin's hand moved an inch closer to his hidden tonfa. I'd say you'd need the devil's luck to make it off this rock afore the white hunter catches wind of you. And to spirit you away to do whatever it is I shan't concern myself with, you'll need Ohama. With that, he waved at a shop that had seen better days in front of a gated-off section of the docks. He went right back to Cloud watching as they shuffled past him. Jin looked up at the sign listing at a slight angle over the dusty windows and beaten door. Shadowhawk Watercraft. The logo was of an attic being clutched in the talons of a skeletal bird. Jin put a foot on the step and pulled his foot back, and the print was clearly visible in the dust. It wasn't the best first impression, but Nami had said they'd get a good deal since business had dried up. Money bag? Jin asked. The carrier sagged as he handed it over. Oh, thank you God. That was killing me. Have you been doing the same training as the rest of us? His fellow tried to tease. Yes, I have, he answered solemnly. Now I know how Nami-sama punches so hard she makes Captain Luffy and Zoro-sensei nervous. Those jugs must be pure muscle, I swear. Don't even joke, man. I don't want to catch the spillover when lightning strikes you down for an infidel, hissed one of the more impressionable Nakama. Jin snapped, regaining their attention. They'd lightened up under the new management, but he was still a strict taskmaster. Keep an eye out in case our guide decides to narc. Try and be inconspicuous. I'm going to see about ending our cohabitation with the superhuman Domingos and the Cococks. So saying, Jin pried open the door and walked in. It looked like an old banker's office. There was a large counter dividing the room in half. On Jin's side, there were a few chairs and nothing more. On the other side, there were filing cabinets, a few lamps, and a freestanding wall and door creating a closed-off area of the rest of the floor. Jin spotted stairs in the back corner and assumed there were living quarters above him. There was a chime bell on the counter like you saw at hotels. Feeling like he was in one of Usopp's cheesy horror stories, Jin dinged the bell. Jin barely detected the sound of movement, and then the door opened to reveal the old Chinese guy from Central Casting. Yellowed skin more spotted than a toad, squinty almond eyes, wispy mustache, gleaming bald spot, braid down to his waist, hunched form making him even smaller than he already was. He lacked the cane, but his hands were hidden in the sleeves of his robes brought together. Had Jin not witnessed Zeph knock Momo unconscious with a walk propelled by the wind of a kick made with his peg leg, he might have dismissed the elder as harmless. Instead, he recognized the stillness of eyes that saw everything and steadiness of limbs that could move faster than thought. This was not a man to mess with. Jin tried not to obviously swallow. Ohama, I presume. The man did not look anywhere but straight ahead as he moved slowly but gracefully from the door to the counter. He climbed a hidden stool until he could see over the edge. Jin noticed it put the man's eyes level with his trachea. Then he spoke in a surprisingly high-pitched, nasal voice that Jin stopped himself from laughing at by the skin of his teeth. You lost, boy. Jin grit his teeth. Depends. Is this the place to get a ship that can dish out some punishment? Other than his mouth, not a single muscle in Ohama's face moved. And just why do you require such a ship? My crew and I are set to travel into some rather hostile waters. I would prefer we be able to defend ourselves. Why were his eyes still on his throat? It was very uncomfortable. How hostile are we talking here? Jin smirked. A cynical man would say we're sailing to our own graveyard. The corner of his lip might have twitched, or it could have been one of his teeth loosening. And would you be able to find yourself on a bulletin board? Jin got the coded question, though why they had to talk in riddles in the man's own office he didn't understand. Indeed, I just appeared yesterday, so I might be the first thing you see. Finally, Ohama looked up into Jin's eyes. It was like looking at death, if death were doing his best to be cordial and non-threatening. Well, you have the balls to sail one of my works. Let's see if you've got the bury. As Jin reached down to haul Marvin onto the counter, his hand brushed his neck and he felt his racing pulse. Wait a minute, was that old man? Yes, I was. Jin jumped a little. What? Ohama turned his stone-cold gaze on Jin. You were wondering if the reason I was staring at your neck was because I was reading your pulse to see if you were lying to me. And I was. For the record, if you had, there's a reason I'm right next to the water. Jin paused. Then his natural gallows humor took over. No offense, but I'm starting to wonder if your lack of business can really be blamed on the Marines. Ohama smiled. No, that's wrong. He bared his teeth. I offer the push out of the nest. If the fledgling is strong, they shall soar. If they are weak, they shall die. It is as simple as that. But Smoker is smashing the eggs before they have a chance to even hatch. His methods are the cause, I assure you. Jin wondered if he'd survive this transaction with control of his bowels. This guy was fucking terrifying. And possibly insane. Fair enough. Ohama's face returned to its flat mask and turned to inspect the sack. He didn't even touch it. 200 million in small bills. I prefer bearer bonds, but beggars cannot be choosers. The shrunken shipbuilder reached into a hidden cubby in the divider and pulled out a booklet. For your consideration, he offered formally with both hands. Jin took it gingerly. He opened it and found a registry of ships. Each had a photo, deck plans, and a brief description including number of cannons and sails. Jin quickly flicked through the selection, looking for something maneuverable to keep up with Mary, little for his comparatively small crew, but capable of living up to the designation of demolition corps of the Armada. So, this voyage of yours, Ohama spoke up. An expedition, is it? For an empty throne, perhaps. Jin couldn't tell if this was small talk or another test. Taking the better part of valor, Jin decided to be upfront, or as upfront as he could be in the riddle speak Ohama seemed to prefer. An escort mission, actually, for the prince. If that managed to surprise him, Ohama didn't show it. I see. That's a difficult path to walk. What do you gain from this arrangement? Jin smiled involuntarily as he thought of his dawn. The privilege of witnessing his ascent, every step of the way. His face hardened, and, if necessary, the honor of dying in his place. The disquieting businessman shook his head. What a limited life you have chosen, one bound by duty and obligation. Jin threw back his head and laughed. Ohama lifted an eyebrow a quarter inch, which to the very few who knew him was the signal he'd been genuinely surprised. When Jin finally regained control of himself, he looked the man he was almost certain had survived the Grand Line right in the eye. I see it the opposite way. I am free. For so many, their fate is beyond their control. It is decided for them by superiors and chance and their own inaction. For me, I know there is no fate but that which I make for myself. I simply need the courage to want it, and the strength to let myself have it. I am free, and I choose to be my friend's loyal shadow. Ohama stared at Jin for a full minute. Just as the devil man's bravado was about to run out, the pirate turned shipwright blinked. I think, he said slowly, that you should take a look at the D-line. With reverence, he pulled out a thinner, much more opulent booklet. Unsure what to make of the new offer, Jin opened the book. He immediately noticed two things. First, that the ships in this book were of noticeably higher quality than those in the regular catalog. Second, most of them were crossed out with a red X. In fact, Jin found, all but one of the ships was gone. In an instant, Jin knew that this was the ship for his crew. A 36-gun frigate, long and low, square-rigged for speed. She would be a sword on the ocean, slicing through the waves to unleash her broadside in a hail of destruction only to move on to the next, in and out before the enemy knew they were sinking. Her name was the Blitz. Jin looked up, but Ohama was already nodding. Fate is the product of our action, but destiny is harder to understand. Take this key, unlock the fence, let your crew through, lock it behind you, then throw the key into the ocean. Jin didn't have enough left in him after his speech to question the monster in human clothing. Thank you, he said as he made to leave. Do not insult me, Ohama commanded firmly. You thank a person when they perform a kindness. This is an exchange. You give me money, I give you a ship. The proper farewell is pleasure doing business with you. Jin felt cold sweat in places he didn't know had glands. All right, I'll remember that. Pleasure doing business with you. With the barest of decorum, Jin exited the office. Ohama sighed as he turned the fancy booklet around. With great ceremony, he pulled out a quill and ink and crossed out the last of his greatest works to find their masters. How the wheel turns, he mused to himself. Years ago, I gave Shanks the push so his master could reach my apprentice and find his true steed. Now, I give another shadow a push, so that he may reach Tom's boy and find the work that will carry them to the end. Ohama took a breath. My time here is done. I should turn my sails to home. Ohama paused and turned his eye to the window, where in the far distance you could just make out storm clouds. But not yet. The day's surprises are not yet done. Zoro was not an idiot. Or rather, he knew he was not a retard. His brain was not smaller or in any way more damaged than the average person. He had no history of concussions. He hadn't gotten a very thorough education as a child. But Kashiro had made sure that he at least knew the birds and bees and how to read and count. He never applied his intelligence, but that wasn't to say he had none. So, given that Zoro was no stupider than the next guy, why was he so often compared to or lumped in with the Luffy? First off, he was stubborn to a fault. Even if he knew he was wrong, even if he knew the odds against him were hopeless, he'd still pursue his given course of action to the death. His persistence hadn't become quite so hazardous to his health until he'd joined the crew, but it had always been there. In arguments, in daily life, in drinking contests, Zoro refused to back down. This inability to yield, in a world of compromise, marked him as a freak. And since people didn't want to admit that this kind of integrity to his beliefs was a strength they envied, they denounced it as a foolish flaw. Second, he was simple. No, not slow, just simple. He didn't needlessly complicate his life. Who needed to know all the minutiae of politics and the balance of power? Why break down everything into ever smaller, more technical parts? What good did philosophic debate or agonizing over ethical conundrums ever do anyone? Zoro had no need for any of that. The sun rose and set. Seasons changed. Alcohol was the gateway to paradise. And a man only needed two things, his balls and his word. Other than how to swing a sword, that was basically all Zoro needed to know in life. So whenever Zoro heard and saw people all but losing their heads over pointless abstract ideas like government or economy or personal hygiene, he could only shake his head at how much stress and worry they went through for no reason. Accordingly, since Zoro had not spent his life amassing schema regarding how the world worked like most people, he had picked up and assimilated a few things as fact that simply, well, weren't. When it came to his health, Zoro honestly believed that if it didn't kill him, then he was okay. And all the nagging Chopper and now Kaya had ever given him over taking it easy or keep your bandages on was just a bunch of coddling. And clouds were just part of the sky, the thing above his head that changed every day. When Nami had first gotten sick from the Kestra and Zoro had been left to steer Mary, he'd just picked the cloud in front of them and tried to keep her straight. Nami raving about how clouds move or change shape was either the ravings of illness or some esoteric idea cobbled together from all her weather books. But knowledge and intelligence aren't necessarily the same thing. A child could be told all their life that the sky is green, and whenever they see that color, they would naturally associate it with green. Just because the rest of the world insisted that it was blue didn't make the child dumb. It just meant they were misinformed. And really, how could anyone be really sure that everyone saw the sky as blue? Or that it truly, objectively, was in fact colored blue? What is blue, really? The point was that just because Zoro believed in things others didn't, it didn't automatically make him an idiot, though that was the most common conclusion. But the third, biggest, and most obvious facet of Zoro's character that made people question whether he had two brain cells to rub together was his sense of direction, or his spectacular, illogical, unholy lack thereof. The cause was unknown, and might forever remain so. Chopper had never gotten his hands on an MRI, so he never got to take a look and see if Zoro had a few wires crossed in his head. All the booze hinted at an explanation, but Zoro was sober most of the time he got lost. Plus, if he was so deep in the bottle that it had damaged his brain, he'd have other, more glaring health problems, and probably would not be fit enough to do all the insane physical acts he could. Short-term memory loss might fit the bill, but Zoro had no trouble remembering names and faces of people he just met or being aware of the world around him. Early-onset Alzheimer's didn't work for the same reason. Some of the misapprehensions he'd picked up on how the whole idea of direction worked were probably a factor, but Zoro failed to follow even those rules consistently. Whether it was any of these things and their possible combinations, something not thought of, or simply divine will, the ultimate observable phenomenon was that Zoro could get lost following someone down a clear straight road. So there you have it. Zoro was not an idiot in the classical sense, being capable of a perfectly average amount of logical reasoning, but he was a bull charging forward without knowing or particularly caring why. Thus, barring an extensive argument over semantics, Zoro was, for all intents and purposes, an idiot. A dumbass, a goober, slack-jawed, a pudwhack, witless as the day was long. You get the idea. And as much as Zoro himself would like to dispute this, his current circumstances didn't exactly help his case. It was ridiculous, really. He had observation. He knew what her aura felt like, albeit with about 2.5 more years of growing. His range was such that he could sense half the city without too much strain. He had actively set out not to run into her. So why, for the love of all things great and small, was he watching one Master Chief Petty Officer Tashigi cut down 2 indignant pirates with more balls than brains? Were Zoro not a staunch apatheist? He might think someone up there had it in for him. The as yet unacknowledged greatest swordsman on the planet heaved a sigh as he watched the ditzy girl trip trying to come out of her stance. And lo and behold, her glasses slid along the ground only to come to a stop against his boot. He might not believe in gods, but he was suddenly open to the idea of ghosts. He could practically hear Kuina and her cocky, mocking drawl. HMPH, a boy afraid of a girl. How pathetic. The strongest in the world, and still so weak. Zoro grit his teeth. He wasn't afraid of the marine girl. She just evoked a big complicated knot of emotions every time he saw her face or heard her speak. And while Zoro would literally rather die than back down in combat, feelings were another thing entirely. Like most men, he adopted a why confront something when you can avoid it attitude to any problem that required inner reflection or tackling psychological hang-ups. He'd planned on never seeing the woman at all, or if he had to, without that whole you lied to me thing that led to her swearing a vendetta against him. But it seemed that just wasn't meant to be. He could have just slipped away before she put on her glasses, but that would be too much like running away. Now that he was there, he might as well face it head on. So he reached down, picked up the corrective eyewear, and held them out to the woman patting the ground like a brainy college kid who'd read too many mystery novels. Here, he grumbled out. Oh, Tashigi grabbed at the tan blur and felt hard plastic. She slipped the frames over her eyes in a motion all but reflex at this point, sighing with relief as clarity returned to her. She looked up to see whoever got off their ass and helped her instead of just watching her flail. Thank you very. Tashiga's words died in her throat. Her first, wild thought was that it was some kind of mask. The kind kids used to scare each other on Halloween. But then the mouth frowned and the eyes narrowed, and Tashigi realized that it was really the man's face, his horrifically scared face. More lines than she could count riddled the surface, clearly the work of a knife or some other kind of blade. The most obvious was the one that went from the curve of his left cheek all the way up to the temple, coming within millimeters of nicking the eye along the way. At least 5 lesser cuts crossed paths with it, and about a dozen minor ones. Her view was blocked by a wide-brimmed hat, but it looked like a couple of the larger cuts even went into his hairline, leaving harsh paths of scar tissue that stopped seemingly natural green bristles from growing ever again. But cuts weren't the only damage, oh no. A jagged puncture wound stood out on his right cheek, as if he'd been shot or stabbed and the knife twisted. A good chunk of his nose was just gone, as if he'd been in a guillotine and moved back a few inches. Burns stood out around his mouth and jaw, like he'd tried to kiss a fire. Tashigi's eyes tracked down, and saw just as much damage on his arms and the part of his chest exposed by his robes. It was like a kaleidoscope of pain, a tapestry of suffering. This was a man who had been to hell and back. Tashigi felt her gorge rise. This was wrong. Something about all those wounds that destroyed flesh sent the sound of sandpaper across a chalkboard through her mind. Her intellectual side promptly told her that she should feel nothing but horror and sympathy for one who'd gone through such torture. But something deep down, in the part that was still just a hairless ape banging stones and trying to survive, screamed danger, danger at a kid-run. It looked like a man, but it couldn't be. No one could endure all that in life. Whatever this thing was, it was not human. So it must be a threat, and threats must be dealt with or you will die. And the scariest part, all of the scars, every single one, was pink, fresh, not fully healed. Whatever the bloody blue hell had happened to this creature, it had happened recently and all at once. And then it spoke, and the illusion shattered. Your stance is too tight. Widen your legs, keep your elbows relaxed, and don't hunch your shoulders. Tashigi was shocked at how normal he sounded. Despite the ruin he had become, his vocal cords seemed unaffected. Then the words actually processed, and Tashigi's jaw dropped. What right did he have to critique her technique? How did he have the gall to just walk up to her and tell her how to wield a blade? But he had already turned and started to walk away. Tashigi got to her feet and chased after the man. She didn't bother to call in the incident with the 2 ne'er-do-wells. With patrols so high after Vice Admiral Garp arrived and promptly took over Captain Smoker's command, they'd be noticed and picked up within 10 minutes. She came within striking distance of him before calling "excuse me," in the tone she used for newbie grunts that thought they could boss her around given her gender. Never mind the fact she was the highest enlisted rank there was. The man paused and looked over his shoulder. Even just a fraction of his face was enough to provoke reflexive repulsion. But Tashigi swallowed her distaste and spoke. "Why did you say that to me?" The man raised what used to be his right eyebrow, but was now more a raised ridge of fibrous tissue with a few stray hairs. "I don't read the news. Is it now illegal to offer someone advice?" Tashigi bristled. There was nothing really condescending in his tone, but the total calm in the face of a fairly pissed military officer implied he didn't see her as a threat. Body language could be as demeaning as words. "And who are you to criticize my swordplay?" she challenged. He turned around to face her fully. As he did, Tashigi belatedly realized he was armed. 3 different katana hung at his right hip. He laid a hand on their hilts, not overtly threatening, more like a reassuring habit. "I know a thing or two." Were Tashigi not mentally reviewing her named blade index, she might have been overanalyzing how his tone was more understated humility, not pedantic mocking. Wado ikamanji, Yubashiri, Sandai kaitsu. Tashigi could barely restrain herself from grabbing them from the man and drawing them to see the beautiful blades hidden by the scabbards, though that probably wouldn't be the safest course of action. Then her natural marine suspicion kicked in. "How did you get your hands on 3 named blades?" The man narrowed his eyes. "I didn't steal them, if that's what you're asking. Wado was given to me by my sensei. Yubashiri and Sandai were gifts from a salesman." Tashigi narrowed her eyes. "The Sandai kaitsu alone is worth 1,000,000 biri. You expect me to believe he just gave them to you?" The walking haunted house prop shrugged. He said meeting a true swordsman was payment enough. "You can ask him if you want. I believe he's the one you left Shiger with." The marine woman felt her stomach drop. "How did you know that? Have you been following me?" Tashigi felt her ire rise, along with a shadow of that fear she'd had since she was 12 and realized she lived in a world filled with people taller, stronger, and bigger than her that saw her as nothing but an object. The man gave her a smile that he might have meant to be reassuring, but the effect was quite the opposite. "Like I said, I know a thing or two." Tashigi shelved that for a later date. "We've gotten off topic. What made you walk up to me and criticize me like that?" The chip in her shoulder flared up. "What, you think that just because I'm a woman that I'm a worse swordsman than you?" The man scoffed at her. Scoffed. She reminded herself that Marines do not attack civilians. But his next words shocked her to her core. "Your gender has nothing to do with it. Your stance was too tight. I would take issue with anyone not swinging a sword properly. If you're going to call yourself a swordsman, you should do it right." That goes for every man, woman, child, or beast that picks up a blade. Tashigi realized her jaw was hanging. She closed her mouth with a snap, which was about all her brain could handle at the moment. She was so accustomed to sexism that its lack threw her off. Oh, she managed. If that's all, I'll be on my way. He turned to go. Tashigi gathered herself. Wait. The man paused, and Tashigi fought to keep her stature from becoming too sheepish. I want to apologize. I misjudged you and overreacted. There's a lot of people who look down on swordswomen, and I've taken to assuming the worst. I shouldn't have accosted you like that. Tashigi gulped. Oh my, and I haven't even properly introduced myself. I am Tashigi, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Logtown Marine Base. She bowed and held out her hand. The man's eyes were blank and unreadable for a few seconds. Then he held out his own hand. Roronoa Zoro. Tashigi expected to feel disgust when her skin met his, but his palm seemed mostly untouched, rough from calluses, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was also pleasantly warm. His name rang a bell just as she pulled away. Oh, so you're that Roronoa Zoro, the bounty hunter who uses 3 swords at once. The man grinned nicely, but his eyes remained guarded. She couldn't really blame him. Marines and bounty hunters had an uneasy relationship at the best of times. One could argue the whole point of wanted posters was to get bounty hunters to try to do what Marines couldn't, and some Marines took issue with the implication they couldn't do their job. Plus, she hadn't done the best job hiding the occasional wince or grimace as her eye noticed some new flaw in his visage. I'm actually out of the bounty hunting business. Tashigi smiled brightly. Oh, that's good. It's a dangerous business, she said, pointedly eyeing his scars. You'll be much better off with some honest work. She hesitated, but decided she'd already put her foot in her mouth and might as well continue. It's also a good thing for your swords. It's a shame that such works of art be used for petty violence. She clutched the loaner she'd gotten from Ipin Matsu to her breast. The 12 superior works, the 21 great works, and the 50 good works. It disturbs me to my bones that so many of those fine blades are in the hands of pirates and bounty hunters. Why must the world be so cruel to them? The swords are crying. That's why I have sworn to not rest until every named blade is out of the hands of evil people. Zoro shrugged. Well, evil is a strong word. You can't blame people for their circumstances or using what tools they have. It's a disgrace. Things of beauty twisted into instruments of destruction. A sword should only ever be raised to keep the peace. Instead, they're used to perpetuate the cycle of violence that has gripped our world. I actually think it's a good thing. Tashigi gaped at him in disbelief. Zoro shrugged and elaborated. I agree with you that swords are beautiful, even artistic treasures, but they are inherently weapons, forged to cause harm. Hoarding them to hang them up on some wall is not honoring them, it's disrespecting them. A blade can only sing in the midst of battle, clashing against its brothers and sisters. So it's for the best that so many are handled by pirates. There's no other profession with so many chances to find yourself in a fight for your very survival. Zoro then grinned. Besides, last I checked, the world's best swordsman was a pirate. Are you saying he's doing swords a disservice? Tashigi swallowed the angry words that welled up in her throat. Well, let's just agree to disagree. I'll respect your opinion, no matter how much I disagree with it. Tashigi frowned. But if you truly believe that it's the duty of swordsmen to use them in combat, why would you quit being a bounty hunter? She blinked as she realized the most obvious possibility. Does it have to do with what caused that? What exactly? He asked. Tashigi grit her teeth. Were it not for the guileless way he said it, she would think he was teasing her. Your scars. Oh, he actually chuckled. No, not at all. Tashigi felt her eye twitch. He seemed awfully nonchalant about whatever torture had marked him for life. Then why? Zoro smirked. Well, it's kind of hard to be a pirate and a bounty hunter at the same time. I'd be arrested every time I tried to turn in a bounty, so I decided to become a full-time pirate. Oh, that makes sense. I guess. Tashigi trailed off, the frightening reality of his words sinking in. Time froze. What? Tashigi stammered. The man in front of her was Roronoa. Zoro tipped his hat to her. Nice to meet you, Tashigi. Remember to open up your form a little. Tashigi felt ice fill her heart. He'd toyed with her. Come hell or high water, he would pay. Tashigi moved to draw her blade, but before an inch had left the sheath, the filthy pirate had swung his arm and somehow kicked up a stiff wind. By the time she had blinked the dust from her eyes, he was gone. Usopp hummed to himself as he browsed the contents of the junk shop. Sochiki no Shimada Yumareta Orwa. This was the 4th such shop he'd scoured that day. He'd spent much less time at Love Pirates than he had in the original timeline. He'd realized by Arabasta that most of the stuff was total junk. There were 1 or 2 hidden jewels in there though, so he'd endured the presence of that super creepy salesman. How he hadn't feared he wouldn't leave the shop without being raped last time was beyond him. There was only so much youthful ignorance and enthusiasm could mask. The man made his skin crawl for the full 6 minutes he'd been in the shop. From there he'd gone to a pawn shop, and from there to a novelty shop, and now he was in what was basically an indoor junkyard. The owner hadn't made any attempt to organize his stock, basically throwing it all into a giant pile in the storeroom. Usopp could have been stepping on gold jewelry for all he knew as he waded through the morass. Usopp-sama, what exactly are we looking for? Larry asked. He and the other two stooges had been designated leaders of the group of buggy pirates assigned to run all of Usopp's purchases back to the ships. Mo and Shemp's groups had already been sent off with bags upon bags of Hozzits and Whatsits. So far as Larry could see, there was no rhyme or reason to the collection of doohickeys. But who was he to question the genius who had made Captain Buggy a living weapon? The sniper and tinkerer extraordinaire is jerked from his self-aggrandizing tune. Anything that looks like it has lots of moving parts, accomplishes some unique function, or has some hidden purpose. Anything interesting, really. Larry nodded, not really understanding. Right. And just what are you going to do with all this stuff? That was really the only noun that encompassed all the miscellanea that had met Usopp's approval. Usopp grinned, and Larry suddenly understood how the man wasn't fazed by Kaya-sama when she had a moment. He was an even bigger crazy than she was. That glint in his eye should come with a government health warning. That was probably one of the cornerstones of their love, actually. Complementary insanities. Make Umux into an army worthy of the Grand Line, of course. ISSC, Larry managed. He lifted a cuckoo clock to find a kind of matryoshka doll of wicker baskets, all nestled within each other. Pardon my asking, but if you wanted to arm us, shouldn't we have gone to an armory or weapon shop? Usopp rolled his eyes. You guys already have enough of those things. Besides, they're so ordinary. Usopp pushed out his tongue like he was trying to get rid of a bad taste. Everyone knows what to expect from a gun or a sword. I want to make things that are unique, that no one has ever seen. Ergo, things they don't know how to deal with. By the time I'm done, every single one of you will have more gadgets and gizmos than a billionaire vigilante with a flair for theatricality and some misplaced sense of self-righteousness. And the captains and officers will possess apparatus of such awesome power they'll go down in legend. Usopp paused. The apparatus, not the people. Who cares about those guys? They're just vehicles for my awesome creations. Usopp cocked his head. I'm starting to sound like that Vegapunk bastard. Is Kaya becoming a bad influence on me? Usopp was suddenly seized by a feeling of bone-chilling terror and absolute judgment. Mistress, I am sorry for my sins because I have offended you. I know I should love you above all things. Help me to do penance, to do better, and to avoid anything that might lead me to sin. Amen. The feeling went away. Usopp sighed. I'm going to pay for that later. A dopey grin covered his face as thoughts so explicit and obscene that to describe them would result in this chronicle's deletion filled his head. Not that that's a bad thing, hee. Odd as his nose was, it bled the same as any red-blooded male's. Usopp-sama, I think I found something. Usopp shook himself out of fantasies of his utter boss of a girlfriend. He turned to see what Larry was talking about, only for his jaw to drop to his chest, retract a little, then dislocate to reach his shoes. Larry cleared some of the debris hanging from his find. Damn, I didn't even know they came this big. Drool started to spread in a puddle across the floor. This rig doesn't seem standard. You think it's old and that's why it's in here. Stars began to float and twinkle in the air. I mean, it's weird, but I don't think it would actually be very practical. Larry, Usopp cut in. If I wasn't understanding orders not to do so with anyone else unless Kaya was there to watch, I'd kiss you. What? Larry asked, turning only to be shocked at the clear signs of Usopp's amazement. What's going on here? You brilliant, lucky bastard, Usopp breathed, not taking his eyes off the gift from the gods. Do you have any idea just how unbelievable a discovery this is? No. That's why I asked. Why, what is this thing? Usopp turned his head away from the optimum viewing angle of the marvel to look Larry in the eye. Judging by the creaking of his neck, it was difficult. That, my friend, Usopp said, manic glee in every inch of his face, is a queen den mushi. Usopp took only long enough to see Larry realize the enormity of this event. Then he went right back to ogling the newfound treasure. A snail as tall as he was, its shell appearing to be uniform gray at a distance, but up close was revealed to be a million shades of green. Blues, reds, browns, and purples blended together so finely that it was hard to tell where one shade ended and another began. On the side of its shell, instead of the usual rotary button rig, was a collection of knobs and slides. The transceiver that stuck up from its other side was not a standard antenna, but a dish with 4 prongs holding up a cylinder. A small latch door was set on the rear of its shell. The slug itself seemed curled up in its shell, but Usopp knew that it would be the softest shade of pink. Queen Den Mushi were the pinnacle of both modern communications technology and the snail hierarchy. Queen was a misnomer, since it wasn't female, but hermaphroditic. Each one was capable of reproducing with itself, producing every single breed of Den Mushi there was. It maintained a telepathic link with every snail it ever made, and if those snails should reproduce on their own, it would be linked to their offspring, and so on ad infinitum. To have a queen was to have access to an unparalleled network of information. Their appeal was also in their rarity. There was estimated to be less than 100 queens in the whole world. The reason was because they could only produce another queen at the end of their natural lifespan, and the newborn queens would usually bond with the first creature to give them food. This is why they couldn't just be stolen. They would actively rebel against anyone they didn't like trying to use them. Most every den mushi was passive and willing to work with anyone, but queens were made of stronger stuff, and the rigs humanity had developed just tapped into their natural telepathic abilities. They weren't mind control machines. Queens were invaluable tools, jealously guarded by their owners. Last Usopp heard, most of them were in the hands of the Marines and world government, with maybe half a dozen belonging to major international corporations. And given how well organized they were in their ability to evade government capture, it was speculated that the Revolutionary Army had at least one. In short, a queen den mushi was worth its weight in platinum and 10-carat diamonds. And Usopp was looking at one in a rinky-dink ma and pop junk store tucked into a log town alley. Miracles do happen. Usopp wasn't particularly worried about it not liking them. If Luffy could tame rogue sea kings with a look, he should have no problem with what was possibly the friendliest species on the planet. Usopp leaped over the detritus in his way to stand beside the Armada's new best friend. He tapped lightly on the shell with his knuckles. Hey, beautiful. Why don't you come out? I want to get a look at you. Please, pretty please. Usopp heard a faint hum. Then, with a sort of schlock sound like pulling a plunger out of a clogged toilet, the creature within the shell emerged. Usopp felt his stomach drop. She was in bad shape. Her skin was wrinkled and spotted and so dry. Her tongue hung out of her mouth, wagging with the wind, looking for some kind of moisture or food but too weak to find any. Her eyes sagged on their stalks, bloodshot and unseeing. Her breathing was heavy and wheezing, like each inhale and exhale was a struggle. She was obviously starving and dehydrated, maybe sick if the white film on her tongue meant anything. The sniper's blood began to boil. He wouldn't describe himself as an animal lover, and most people saw den mushi as little more than bugs or an appliance no different than the refrigerator. But it was impossible to spend any appreciable amount of time around Gaiman and not learn to appreciate that humans were far from the only significant form of life on the planet. This was a living creature, deprived of its basic needs and in pain. It was cruelty, plain and simple. Usopp's face hardened. Larry, give her your water. Slowly, don't want to overwork her. I'm going to have a word with the shopkeeper. Larry nodded silently. He'd yet to see Usopp actually fight anyone seriously, but the way he could stand unashamed next to Captain Luffy and Zoro-sensei told him all he needed to know. He almost felt sorry for the owner. Then he looked at the queen again, and his lips thinned. Almost. Larry uncorked his canteen and tilted it just so that it dripped slowly into her gaping mouth. She coughed whenever she tried to swallow more than a sip's worth, but slowly and steadily she got the precious necessity of life. As he did this, patting her on her disturbingly slimeless head, Larry listened to the confrontation happening on the other side of the wall in the shop proper. He didn't need to try too hard. Usopp seemed to have temporarily reached Nami in a temper levels of volume. What excuse do you have for the horrible condition of that poor creature in there? Blah blah, blah 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 blah. You forgot. Are you kidding me? That's one of the most precious life forms in the world in there. When was the last time you even went back there? Blah 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 blah. Yes, I want to buy it, you idiot. Though at this point I see it more as a rescue. Blah 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 blah. Are you taking the piss? She's sick and dying. Like hell I'm going to give you that much for her. For all I know she could kick it before we got her to my ship. Blah 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 blah. Yes, I know what caveat emptor means, you lowlife liar. Blah blah. Oh, so it's like that, is it? Well, it behooves me to remind you that abuse of a type B creature is punishable by up to 2 years in jail and or a 25 million BERI fine. So should I just take this to the relevant authorities, or are you going to stop busting my balls on this? Blah. Glad we could come to an understanding. Usopp re-entered the storeroom, backed by the rest of the buggy crew. She's over there, boys, he pointed, perfectly jovial and convivial. His voice wasn't even raspy. Larry shook his head. The Straw Hat crew were something else. It took a few minutes of shoving to clear a path, unheeding of the sound of breaking glass or crumbling metal. It was a challenge to work out how to lift her, but Usopp managed to coax her to retreat into her shell. The unmistakable expression of fear on her face as she did, like she didn't know if she would come back out, put steel in all their spines. They each shot the owner a nasty glare as they hauled the half-ton of gastropod out of there. Larry hid a grimace. The buggy crew had been training the longest. But this thing was still freaking heavy. You coming with us, Usopp-sama? The man shook his head. I ordered a shipment of chemicals before I left Gecko. It should have arrived by now. I'm going to pick it up and drop it off before making for the square. Larry frowned. The merchant docks are on the other side of town. You sure you'll make it in time? Usopp raised a brow as if to say really. 1,000 Buri says I'll beat you guys to the ships. Larry remembered just who he was talking to. He'd seen Sanji, with legs of titanium, go from one end of the Mary to the other in the time it took to blink. And he'd heard the man admit that Usopp was probably faster than him in a pinch. No bet. Usopp grinned and vanished. Sanji sucked deeply on his cigarette. A full inch of the roll turned into ash, out of courtesy, for he was a gentleman above all. He took it out and tapped the burnt tobacco off onto the street so as to not risk any getting on the merchandise in front of him. He focused and blew the resultant smoke out through his nostrils, appreciating the burn in his sinuses. Then he put the smoldering stick back in his mouth and locked it in place with a quick maneuver of his tongue. Let's go over this one more time, Sanji bit out, holding back the urge to introduce his heel to the fishmonger's skull. You're selling these fish at 800 buri per pound, but you have a deal where 20 pounds go for 15,000. You have 99 pounds of fish here. Instead of just letting me round up and give you 75,000 for 100 pounds, you want me to pay 60,000 for 80 pounds and then 15,200 for 19 pounds piecemeal, for a total of 75,200 buri. That's correct, sir, said the flat-faced man before him. Sanji took a drag down to the filter. It's 200 buri, man. That's what? One extra beer at the bar tonight. The man smirked. If it's such an insignificant amount, why bother holding out on me? Sanji resisted the urge to chew the butt. That would be a bad habit on top of a bad habit. To resist temptation, he pulled out a silver canister and deposited it to join the other corpses of the cigarettes he'd smoked that day. One thing living out at sea taught you was to use every resource. He'd grind them up into mulch for Nami Swan's tangerines later. You know, you're hardly the only stall here, Sanji bluffed, gesturing around at the bustling fish market. The man shrugged. Then go buy from someone else. But there was a taunting tilt to his eyebrows. Though I doubt they'll have adolescent East mackerel. Sanji grit his teeth. East mackerel was a notoriously fickle fish. In youth, it had a delicate texture and full flavor, but once adult it toughened up and lost most of its potency. The trick was to get them just before they reached maturity, when they were the biggest size and still retained their taste. They would make a good celebration dish, suitable for, say, surviving Reverse Mountain and reaching the Grand Line. But Sanji's pride as a haggler refused to cave. He tried a different tack. Are you sure you weighed them right? Some of these seem awful big. You positive it's not an even 100? The man laughed. Actually, it's 98.973, but I decided to be nice and round up. Sanji felt his eyes start to twitch. You're really not bending on this. It's just 2 coins. The man matched his stare without blinking. 75,200 buri. Take it or leave it. A beat. 2. A temple vein pulsed. Fine, penny pincher. Sanji counted out the bills and dug into his wallet to find 2 100 buri coins. The man grinned and put them into his lockbox while Sanji asserted his authority as personal chef to the future pirate king to make 2 Barady cooks behind him heft up the fish and pack them into bags of ice. They had already gotten meat, flour, spices, and other essentials. Now the Barady crew had come to the Logtown fish market, revered for its variety and quality. Zeph and Sanji obviously didn't have to carry anything, which left the burden of carrying enough supplies to feed a small army to the cooks. Zeph had cut off their whining by decreeing the whole thing an exercise. If their legs so much as wobbled, they would get a double shift on the pedals. Sanji maneuvered through the crowd to stand beside his adoptive father. He was definitely a better one than his real one. Sanji shot down the thought and tucked it into the little black box that was his early childhood. He was not the 3rd son of the Vinsmoke family. He was just a chef on the greatest pirate crew in the world. Much as it vexed him at the time, it was probably for the best his bounty poster was just a sketch. His family might recognize him if they saw him. Never mind that they hadn't seen him since he could count his age on his fingers. Though Sanji had never seen his updated bounty poster before the ambush, so maybe they finally got a photo, which might have brought up a few issues since they were in the new world at the time. Sanji sighed. The whole period right before they'd been thrust into the past was a real mess. When Sanji and his group had ignored Luffy's order to go on to Zoo, shit had gone down. They'd managed to survive the encounter with Big Mom's ship by the skin of their teeth. But Caesar had been kidnapped in the confusion. Law had been pissed when he found out, and he'd declared the alliance officially over. Luffy, torn up over losing a friend but unwilling to blame his nakama, had decided they should quietly sail away in the night instead of sticking around to revel in Dressrosa's liberation. And 2 weeks later, they were in the past. Sanji shook himself out of moping. That time was over. Now was the time of the Armada. The blonde focused on what Zeph and Mayasa were arguing over. I know it's your favorite snack, but you can't deny it's an acquired taste, Zeph said in the tone of one trying to explain to a child why they couldn't have their favorite toy. Is essential to life on sea. Puts salt in blood. Besides, helps potency. Very important, the brawler turned commies argued. Zeph fiddled with the end of his mustache. He turned to Sanji. Oi, eggplant, would that captain of yours eat pickled herring? Sanji snorted. I've seen him eat wax paper. It's all the same to him, really. Why? Zeph hooked his thumb at the man carrying 2 full haunches of beef on his shoulders without complaint. Pause, this idiot is insisting we get some, and I'm getting tired of arguing. If the wannabe king eats it, the rest of those brats will eat it without complaint. Sanji sighed. Look, Mayasa, if you want to buy a little to make for yourself, that's fine. But it's a serious diuretic. And the men are already training twice a day. We only have so much clean water, let's not increase the demand, okay. If it were possible for a hardened thug to pout, Mayasa accomplished it. But I already bought vodka, he protested. The chef and his former sous exchanged hidden grins. Oh, I don't think that'll go to waste, Zeph consoled. Their attention was grabbed forcibly by the outraged shout of Patty. You call this fresh caught? I know for a fact this fish is only found in West Blue. Stop trying to push this shipped-in crap and show me some honest East Blue stock. Zeph sighed. It's like herding howler monkeys. I swear, he muttered to himself as he went to do damage control, Sanji tagging along. They found Patty arguing with a man twice his size, with a far friendlier expression than the cook had at the moment. And Chan, I assure you, these were caught off the coast just this morning. Do I look like an idiot? Patty held up a green fish with a wide jaw. This is West Grouper, don't try to deny it. It's from the other side of the world, not local waters. What you fail to appreciate, you miserable excuse for a cook, Sanji spoke up, is the unique nature of Logtown. It's right by the Grand Line, where all the rules go out the window. These fish probably got caught in a deep ocean current, pulled through one of the holes in the red line, and wound up here. Patty turned and snarled. Stop talking out your ass, kid. It doesn't work like that. Actually, that sounds about right, Zeph stated. Patty turned to regard his boss in horror. If you paid attention to what your eyes were telling you instead of what your mind thinks is true, you'd see that these fish were swimming just this morning. There's no signs of being shipped or packaged at all. As one of my cooks, I thought you would be able to assess the quality of your ingredients. Well, owner Zeph, you see. The man floundered. Zeph ducked his head sharply to bonk him on the head with his hat. You need to open up your mind a little, Patty, or you'll be in for a serious shock once we get to the Grand Line. Now say sorry to the nice man and pay for the fresh-caught West Blue fish. Hanging his head and grumbling under his breath, Patty paid the perpetually smiling fisherman. It's things like this that prove all blue isn't just a myth, Sanji said to Zeph. The New World veteran turned to leer at his apprentice. There's nothing wrong with being optimistic. But a few scattered schools in the wrong ocean are hardly proof that a place where every fish can be found is possible. Sanji grinned conspiratorially as he lit a fresh cigarette. Let me tell you my theory. He began. Reverse Mountain is the key to all blue. Waters from all four seas rushing towards and commingling at one point. Naturally, those waters carry fish with them. When they reach the peak, what happens to them? They don't go down the route into paradise, or else all blue would be around the Twin Capes and hardly a fairy tale. Sanji turned to face the distant snow. I think they fall over the other side, into the New World. And before you say they couldn't survive the fall, it's not like the canals are the only breaches in the Red Line. Fishman Island is proof of that. There must be tunnels below the surface. Simple erosion would explain that. And if they should let out on the other side of the mountain? Zeph felt his eyes widen without his conscious command. An old hope, weathered and beaten by age, fluttered with new life. Then that would mean all blue is around Raftel, Sanji asserted with confidence, or at least near the end of the New World. Given how few survived to see that far, it's no surprise that only a handful of people would have found all blue. Just a story, told through the ages until it was mere legend. Sanji turned to look at his mentor, his eyes alight with childish excitement. It makes sense, doesn't it? So it's just as well you're catering for the future pirate king, shitty old man. You're riding shotgun towards your dream. Sanji blew out a cloud, which through some secret known only to chronic smokers was shaped like a fish. It's not there. I'll have to scour the world to find it. Which works out, since Nami Swan's dream is to draw a map of the world. Zeph raised a brow. He was used to seeing a nosebleed or at least a perverted gleam to the eye whenever Sanji so much as thought about a woman. When he mentioned the navigator, his cheeks went pink and his face just seemed happier. You sweet on her. More so than you are for every woman you see, I mean, Zeph asked offhand. Not like he really cared about the eggplant's love life. But the same rules applied regarding his kitchen. Whether he was with the straw hat boy or the thief girl. Sanji looked away. My heart belongs to every lady in the world. As such, I can never promise to be loyal to any of them. And no lady deserves any less than a man completely and utterly devoted to her. So I shall settle for being but a passing knight, chivalrous and kind, a slave to all, and so traitorous to none. Zeph snorted. A fancy way of saying you're a lech afraid to commit. Sanji sighed. I'm not denying my faults. I'm acknowledging them. I'm weak to the wiles of women, this I know. I could never be sure I would resist temptation, no matter how sincere my affections for one special lady. So best that I stick to bachelorhood. The only heart at risk of being broken in that case is my own. Zeph scratched his lip. His mustache could get rather sweaty at times. Whatever, brat. It's your life. Sanji nodded. Then he called out without looking Karn. You find what I asked for. The sunglasses aficionado walked up to Sanji, staggering under the weight of a colossal fish balanced precariously over his shoulder, along with 3 bags of other supplies. I couldn't believe it, but you were right. They did have a blue-finned elephant tuna. Never thought I'd get to see one of these in real life. Sanji grinned, then looked up at the sky. It was clear and sunny, but there was a gathering breeze. Some far-off white clouds seemed to be picking up speed. Treat her like a lady, you hear me? And get ready for a hasty exit when you get back to the ships. After Luffy gets done at the execution platform, things might get a little frantic. And just like that, Sanji vanished. Or one to have a high-powered magnifying glass on hand. They might have noticed 10 tiny dents in the concrete he had just been standing on. Karn gaped. How does he do that? Zeph narrowed his eyes. I'm beginning to ask myself the same thing. Luffy stood tall and proud, simply taking in the beauty of the scene. It was here in this exact spot that, 22 years ago, Gall D. Roger had died by the sword before his disease could finish him off. Luffy could respect that. If one had to die, best to do it on your own terms, rather than from the whim of some invisible germ or defect of your body. He pointedly ignored the part of his mind that was gibbering that he could just as easily meet his own end here today. After all, death would be an awfully big adventure. Luffy breathed deep, taking in the sight of Logtown spread out before him. His mind felt clear for the first time in hours, now that he wasn't masking his aura, presence, voice, whatever anymore. Now it was just a matter of time until Gramps found him. And when he did, he'd enact his plan. Luffy looked down into the crowd, hoping there wouldn't be any collateral damage. Gramps was a Marine and duty-bound to protect civilians. But he might forget little things like that in the heat of anger. The pirate spotted a familiar head of green, though, and his fears were allayed. It had been quite refreshing to talk to Bartolomeo without him falling down in worship at his every word. Luffy looked both ways before he crossed the street. With all his observation turned inward, he wouldn't sense his Gramps if he were just around the corner. Seeing no one, Luffy moved forward to knock on an unassuming door. A slide at eye level opened. "What do you want?" came a gruff voice. Luffy flipped the mental switch to go into captain mode. Gramps had always stressed the importance of attitude and bearing when entering a meeting. "I want to talk to your boss," he answered. "And why should he waste his time on you?" Luffy cocked his brow. "You read the newspaper yesterday?" Luffy distinctly heard a gulp. The slide closed. Luffy tried not to let his nervousness show. The longer he stood here, the higher the chances a passing Marine would spot him, given he'd seen at least 5 different people interrogated just for wearing a hat made of straw. No matter how little they looked like him, Luffy didn't want to take any chances. The door opened, revealing a bald man bulked up to the point it was obscene. Luffy wasn't impressed. That kind of muscle was mostly for show, even if they were as strong as the size implied. Their joints and full body coordination surely suffered from the isolating exercises that made them that way. Luffy would have been surprised that this guy could touch his toes, and not surprised at all if he could break him over his knee without even trying. "The boss will see you." Luffy nodded and walked in, the door closing behind him. Luffy walked through a house with each room filled with goons. All of them eyed him warily. He ignored their mutterings. He wasn't here to start a fight. If they didn't start anything, nothing would happen. Luffy reached another door. The bald bodybuilder knocked, and Luffy heard a sharp "come in." The bald guy opened the door and ushered Luffy in, then followed and closed it behind him. He crossed his arms and stood menacingly in front of the only exit, or at least the only obvious one. There is always the wall. Luffy regarded the man who in another life was his biggest fan. Green hair growing wild and untamed. No eyebrows, eye tattoos. Fur-lined jacket open over a leonine torso bearing another tattoo. And, most noticeable, a big gold ring through his septum. He was sitting in a swivel chair behind an oak desk, both probably stolen. Luffy decided to be polite and pretend not to notice the cold sweat that broke out the moment he entered the room. Luffy nodded. Bartolomeo, right. He made an effort to say his name right. He had a feeling this version wouldn't be as cool with being called Fart. The mafia leader nodded. "And the infamous Monkey D. Luffy, I presume. Surprised to see you here. How'd you find this place?" Luffy shrugged. "That guy you sent to collect protection money from the deli. Good at dodging patrols, not so much at looking for tails. Let me write to you." Bartolomeo grit his teeth. "I'll keep that in mind." Then he bared his fangs in a smile that would intimidate weaker men. Figured a guy good enough to get that high a price would be smart enough to not dock on an island filled to bursting with Marine. "Surprised an operation like yours managed to last this long on an island full of Marines?" Luffy shot back. This was pro forma, trying to one-up each other, or so Gramps told him. "Let me guess. With your ability, you're the one person Smoker would have to actually work to capture. And since pirates started to steer clear, the people need something to remind them why they need the heavy hand of the government. So he, or someone up the food chain, decided to let you go on unmolested so long as you keep things small scale." "That sound right." Bartolomeo grit his teeth and turned a funny shade of red. Luffy belatedly remembered this guy had a serious temper. "What do you want?" he spat out. Luffy sighed. I figure you guys would want a chance to protect your city. For financial reasons, if nothing else. If people are bussing paying hospital bills, they can't pay you, right? Bartolomeo narrowed his eyes. You threatening my town? Luffy shook his head. On the contrary, I'm warning you, there's going to be an incident at the town plaza. People could get hurt. I was hoping that your men could clear out the people and stick around so no one gets suspicious. Bartolomeo cocked his head. What kind of incident are we talking here? Luffy gave a sickly grin. Let's just say that when the monkey family has a reunion, property damage is to be expected. Luffy was jerked from his memories by a buzz from the crowd below. Luffy watched with ratcheting heart rate as he saw a tall man in a gray suit push his way through the crowd, a full squadron of Marines following behind him. Well, time to face the music. Monkey D. Garp walked past the fountain until he was at a 45-degree angle from the top of the execution platform. Then he looked up and pierced his grandson with a glare that contained all the white-hot intensity of 1,000 suns. Luffy, that one word was more effective than a blast of King's disposition. It was like watching a ripple as people began to edge away from the Vice Admiral. The fury coming off of him was practically tangible. Luffy remained outwardly calm, though inside he was trembling as much as pre-time Scapuza. Hey, Gramps, wow, I can see your veins from here. Have you been taking your blood pressure medicine? You know Bogart wouldn't bug you if it weren't important. Brat, he cut off. He tapped his foot and sent a spider web of cracks into the pavement. I'm going to give you one chance to explain yourself. If I don't like your answer, I'm throwing you into impel down myself until I think you've learned your lesson. Luffy tensed. This was it. Time to see if his desperate gamble worked. Zoro shrugged. Better than 11%. Let's hear it. Luffy spoke like he was trying to convince himself as much as them. Look, I got into this mess thanks to vaguely worded, technically true statements. Maybe they can get me out of it. What do you mean? Nami demanded. Luffy sighed, a pained expression on his face. I'm going to play on my grandfather's deepest fears, and when I see an opening, I'm going to take it. I had an epiphany, Luffy said calmly. Garp cracked his knuckles. Oh, really? What was it exactly? Luffy breathed deep. Then he committed to hurt his Gramps worse than he ever had before. If I became a Marine, I would surely perish. Garp grit his teeth so hard his dentist would notice cracks. That's your excuse. You were afraid to get killed. Marines lead a dangerous life. I told you that from day one. You telling me I trained a coward? You misunderstand, Luffy interrupted. I did not say I would die in battle. I said I would perish, disappear, or maybe, if they wanted to make a point of it, executed. That drew Garp up short. What the hell are you talking about? The straw hat that had seen so much shadowed its current wearer's eyes. A healthy tree may bear a bad apple, but the tree is still seen as healthy. That one bad apple is just bad luck. But only a bad seed may grow from bad soil. Its nature is decided for it by the circumstances of its creation. Luffy looked into his Gramps' eyes. He didn't have to fake the regret weighing them down. I may be your beloved grandson, Gramps, but nothing you do, nothing you say, nothing I say or do will change the fact that I'm his son. Gramps looked down, a bad taste in his mouth. His greatest shame was being hurled in his face. I'm not saying it would happen right away, Luffy continued. It might take a week, it might take months. Hell, it might be years. But sooner or later, they'll start to think it, that I'm a sleeper agent, or that I'm leaking information, or just that my goddamn blood is dirty. And it wouldn't matter if I was the commander-in-chief when it happened. They would kill me without a second thought, for the good of the world. And there wouldn't be anything I could do to defend myself. For my sin, Luffy forced out. The words of a fanatic who had shattered his world echoing in his ears, is existing. Garp shook his head in denial. No, they wouldn't do that. Luffy hardened his heart. Batarilla. Garp looked up in shock as he mentioned that taboo name. Based on the rumor of a rumor, Marines spent over a year scouring the island for a sign, any at all, of a child of the Pirate King. Pregnant women were kidnapped to be put through blood tests. Infants were put through the most invasive, comprehensive battery of exams available. Any who resisted were executed. Luffy spat. And if they had found such a child, he would have been murdered in his cradle, in the womb. Luffy narrowed pitying eyes at the horrified Garp. This is how much stock the world government puts in a person's bloodline. Do you deny it? Garp fought tears of anger, frustration, and guilt. Luffy, you fool. I thought of all that. I cleared everything with Sengoku. You would have had a fair chance. Ah, but Sengoku isn't the top of the food chain, is he? Luffy fired back. Even he must bow to orders from Kong or the Gorosei. And it's not like he'll be Fleet Admiral forever. Can you imagine how Sakazuki would react to news of his son in the Marines' ranks? His first order after being promoted would be my death warrant. Garp felt like his world was crumbling. Luffy, Kong's a good man. And I know people don't always understand why they do what they do, but the Gorosei are just. They wouldn't kill you just because. O'Hara and Nico Robin. Luffy smiled sadly at the surprised look on his Gramps' face. The voice had told me a lot, Gramps. Garp tried a different tack. Sakazuki isn't the only one who could take Sengoku's place. He might never find out. Oh, yes, I might be spared from absolute justice, but that doesn't mean I'm safe. Luffy felt like his heart was breaking, watching his grandpas fall to pieces, but he continued. For his Nakama. Husen and his lazy justice would wait a decade after he heard the truth, but eventually he would act. And with that unclear justice of Borsalino's, he might not even go for he. He would go for Daden and Fuchsia for not lynching me when I was young. Luffy shook his head, noting the sky becoming dark and gray. I'm sorry, Gramps. I truly am. I know you believe in redemption, but your superiors don't. They only understand corruption. And there's not a single future where if I became a Marine I would not die. And it was the truth. The voice confirmed it. Luffy had felt pity for his grandfather for the first time when he realized that. A great man he might be, and one with more experience than almost anyone, but he was still so naive when it came to the ugly side of the people he'd sworn to serve. Luffy, Garp breathed out. He had to be lying. He had to. This couldn't be true. His hopes, his dreams, his utmost desire, his careful plans to ensure his grandsons be spared from the sins of their fathers. It couldn't all be for naught. I like to think I'm a decent guy, Gramps, but I'm not so selfless as to knowingly go to my death just so I might be able to help save people. Luffy looked up. So, if the path of a Marine was barred from me, what else could I do? How can I live my life in a world that does not want me to survive? Luffy grinned and prepared to fight. That's when I remembered an old dream. Well, he'd never stopped thinking about it, but he did think about it the same day he found out the truth of his fate as a Marine. Garp felt his stomach drop. No, don't say it, he begged. Luffy flung out his arms and shouted with all the air in his body. I will become the Pirate King. In that moment, Garp gave up any hope his grandson could be saved. And in that moment, his guard was down. Luffy grabbed the edge of the platform and launched himself at Garp. Gamu Gamu no bunker buster, he screamed, activating armament Tekai as he went through the air. He hit his Gramps right in the chest with all the force of a meteor, sending up a cloud of dust. When it cleared, Garp was lying insensate in a crater, his grandson standing over him. I'm sorry, Gramps. Then Luffy hopped out of the hole he'd created and faced the wall of muskets aimed at him. Monkey D. Luffy, surrender yourself. We have you surrounded, shouted an ensign with a megaphone, sounding remarkably steady given the spreading stain on his pants. Luffy grinned. No, you're surrounded. Luffy threw back his head. Everyone, now. And with that, the armada charged into the plaza from where they'd been hiding, and the world dissolved into chaos. Bara Bara cannon. Buggy yelled as he shot his hands into the crowd of Marines. When I say 1, 2, Django, you will see friends as enemies and enemies as friends. 1, 2, Django. The captain of the Black Cat smirked as the dozen Marines that had charged him suddenly turned around and began to attack their fellows. Jin didn't bother to name his attacks. He just tore through all in his way like a sickle through wheat. In the midst of all this madness, a tense standoff occurred between two swords. People, it was unclear what the proper term was. You dared to talk down to me when you're worse than scum yourself, Tashigi accused. Zoro rolled his eyes. Believe what you will of my character. I just wanted to give some helpful advice to a fellow swordsman. Tashigi bared her teeth. On behalf of the Marines, I hereby confiscate your named blades. In the name of justice. Yeah, not going to happen, Zoro stated. The scorned woman, a fury worse than any hell could produce, narrowed her eyes. Then I shall take them from your corpse. Good luck with that, Zoro said around a yawn. Seeing red, Tashigi drew Shiger, freshly sharpened and ready for battle. She hesitated when her opponent made no move to do so likewise. What, I'm not good enough for you to use your swords? She roared. Nothing like that. I'm just under strict orders from my nurse not to use any swords in any way, shape, or form. Zoro reached down into a downed Marine's hands and extracted a knife. This'll do. It's a dagger. Completely different. Tashigi had never felt so angry in her life. You mock me, even now, she demanded. Zoro didn't even reach for his bandana, though it would be awkward to take off his hat to put it on. Maybe he should get a string attached like Luffy had. No offense, he drawled, but I'm more afraid of her than I am of you. With a hearty battle cry, Tashigi rushed forward. She swung down in a textbook strike, putting all the force of her body into this opening blow. Zoro made a simple sweep of his arm and deflected it, sending her sprawling past him. Shaking her head, Tashigi regained her footing. She lunged at Zoro's back, only to hit open air as he turned to the side. And so it went. Every move Tashigi made was dodged or made to miss. Throughout the fight, Zoro maintained his bored expression. He didn't even seem to be trying. Finally, Tashigi went for a feint before slashing straight for his neck. Zoro used his dagger, holding it up in a block. Tashigi was stopped cold. All her training, all her effort, all her adrenaline and energy, and his arm didn't even bend. Then his other arm came up and knife-handed her wrists. She dropped her blade, the motion involuntary, and before she could blink she felt cold steel on her neck. She narrowed her eyes through the rain and sweat. You cheated. Zoro grinned ironically. Pirate, he reminded. Tashigi resigned herself. Get it over with then. Zoro raised a brow before removing the knife. He tossed it aside and faced her evenly. Tashigi didn't know whether to be outraged or relieved. Mercy, from a pirate. What, is it because I'm a woman? I assure you, this is more insulting than flattering. It's custom to kill the enemy when you beat them, so at least offer me that much respect. That's true, but I haven't actually beaten you, Zoro explained. Tashigi gaped at him. What are you talking about? You've disarmed me. How is that not a clear victory? It's not a victory because this wasn't a true battle. Neither of us were at my best. Zoro fingered his eye scar. I'm not fully recovered from my injuries, and you haven't realized your full potential by half. Zoro grinned. Go back to your training, find your limits, and then surpass them. And when the day comes that you've become the best you can become, come find me. And on that day, we will fight for real. Tashigi couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was he complimenting her, encouraging her to beat him? It made no sense. Of course, I can't risk you stabbing me in the back, so. Tashigi suddenly felt like a battering ram was thrust into her solar plexus. Her lungs were suddenly out of air, and she descended into darkness. Captain Smoker, the White Hunter, Navy HQ captain and commander of the Logtown Marine Base, faced his opponent. I'm afraid your journey ends here, he growled. Luffy stuck his finger in his nose up to the knuckle. Whatever you say, Smokey. The chain smoker felt his last nerve snap and launched his fist forward from his body. White blow. Luffy tilted his head to avoid the fist, then reached up and grabbed the smoke, and squeezed. Smoker was brought to his knees at the blinding pain of his wrist being not just broken, but crushed. The next thing he knew, harsh metal was going down his spine and into his pants. All of a sudden the strength fled from his body and he realized what happened. As he collapsed, he looked up at the grinning pirate. Damn you, he managed. Luffy shrugged. Hey, I could have stuck that sea stone in a much more uncomfortable place. You're good, Smokey, but nowhere near my league. Better luck next time. Luffy walked away from the transmigrant of Javert to survey the battlefield. He debated letting his men fight it out and gain experience or just blast them with conquerors and hit the road. The choice was taken from him when something, not observation, just pure reflex and instinct, screamed at him to dodge. Luffy jumped to the side. It was a good thing he did. The blackened fist that went through the space he just occupied would have turned his bones into dust. Luffy looked up in horror. Gramps, but I knocked you out. Your voice went quiet. Luffy trailed off as he saw the blank white of his grandfather's eyes and the tiniest of snot bubbles hanging from his nose. Are you kidding me? You're not even conscious and you're trying to kick my ass. His Gramps' unconscious response was to spring at him. Luffy took to the air, trying to Jeppo away from the ground zero that was the inevitable result of Garp fighting. He was snatched from the air by something even faster, and Luffy found himself slammed face first into the execution platform. Luffy, Nami shouted from where she was casually electrocuting some hapless Marines. Luffy felt the horror and worry spread through his various crews as he heard the creaking of bone and muscle that told him his Gramps was winding up. Huh, so this is how it ends, Luffy thought. Conquerors wouldn't work, his Gramps wasn't even awake, and he had no leverage in this position. He was helpless. Luffy felt a sense of peace suffuse his soul. Ah, well, at least I know they can take care of themselves. Everyone, he called out, beginning his last proclamation as captain. Sorry, he looked up, grinning like a loon. Time to see what came next. But I quote him dead. A lightning bolt that dwarfed any that Nami could possibly struck down from the heavens. The entire execution platform was consumed by blue fire. It collapsed to the aside, reduced to mere burning wood and scorched metal. A straw hat floated down through the air, only to be caught by a tan hand. Luffy stuffed hat back on his head. Never mind, he shouted. Siam and Butcheye looked at each other. Makes sense, he's our new captain, wouldn't you say? I hear you, brother. He's got more lives than all of us put together. Richie huffed in relief. Chief Bellascratcher was unharmed. The pride would remain intact. Pearl hung his head. That does it. I got to get over this stupid phobia. If the Dawn can walk away from that without blinking, I got no right freaking out over a few drops of blood. Luffy looked back at the burnt husk of his grandfather. He had no doubt they would meet again. Hopefully when he was in a better mood. Everyone, let's go home, he shouted. He didn't think they'd meet any resistance along the way. Most of the Marines had thrown down their arms and held up hands in subjection after seeing him shrug off a few billion joules. Speaking of which, Luffy paused as he was walking along the main street behind his men. Thanks for the save, Dad. In a flash, Monkey D. Dragon appeared before him. He grinned, a much harsher smile than Luffy had inherited from Garp. I was only doing what any father should do. Luffy shrugged. Fair enough. Though mind telling me why this is the first time we're meeting? The revolutionary's eyes grew sad. I wanted you to grow up safe, free from the dangers that follow me constantly. As you know, any association with me can only hurt you. He looked away. And, to be honest, a child was a distraction and weakness that I, and therefore the world, simply couldn't afford. Luffy nodded. Makes sense, I guess. Dragon raised a brow. That's it. I'm not going to blame you for me being alive. That's stupid. You are who you are, and that's that. And I never felt like I was missing anything, so I won't hold your absence against you. Dragon looked like a weight had dropped from his shoulders. There was still plenty there, but even a little relief felt great. Thank you. I've done nothing you need to thank me for, Luffy countered. Not that I'm complaining, but why'd you take time off from saving the world to see me off? Dragon grinned. I wanted to see what kind of man you are. Pirate King is fine with me, by the way. I planned to just observe, but now it seems I can ask you myself. Luffy quirked his mouth in a half-smile. I'm a guy of simple taste. As long as I have meat in my belly, my nakama beside me, and the freedom to go where we will, I'm good. All that stuff I told Gramps about the Marines is true, but I also just wouldn't be able to stand life as a soldier. I'm not one for taking orders. The bane of generals and statesmen everywhere, an individualist. Dragon looked up. You and your men will have a tailwind. Godspeed. Thanks. Luffy walked a few steps, then paused. Oh, wait. You know how you can make up for 17 years of missed birthday presents? Dragon looked back. How? Have Sabo at Nanohana in Arabasta in 24 days. Dragon had to strive not to drop his jaw. Why? He questioned. He'd heard Luffy mention the voice, so it wasn't beyond the realm of possibility he'd investigated his father's operations. But why would he be interested in his second? Luffy grinned nostalgically. It's been 10 years. I want to meet my brother again. Dragon's eyes widened as he connected the dots. He'd known Sabo came from the same island, but he'd never guessed. I'll see it done. Oh, and let me guess. Mystical Zoan fruit. Azure Dragon of the East. Power over the storms and lightning. But Dragon was already gone. Luffy huffed and pursed his lips. Jerk. It was with jubilance that the armada sailed away from Logtown. It was raining buckets, and the wind was blowing something fierce. But none of that mattered in light of the excitement, fear of setting off for the Grand Line. Granted, there was almost a mutiny when the men refused to man the lines in favor of ogling Alvida. But Nami and Kaya set them straight. Mostly Kaya. Luffy grinned wide enough to split his head in half when he spotted the guiding light. Men, break the casks. Everyone get a drink, right now. We're a little busy at the moment, you know. Kabaji shouted, feeling almost naked without his unicycle as he shuffled along the mast of the big top. Don't care. Captain's orders. Zeph sighed. I'll get the glasses. With a lot of near-miss spills, every man eventually had a glass full of some form of alcohol. Luffy grinned at his crew. They would always have the memory of their own personal ceremony. This was for the Armada. To the Grand Line. To One Piece. To live what we dream. Kanpai. It was raining. Well, that was understatement. Technically, the verb raining could equally apply to both a barely there drizzle and a torrential flood. At present, it was definitely more the latter than the former. Water fell from the sky in sheets, twisted as they fell by the wind to make vague shapes you could just make out. Anyone outside was soaking, moisture sinking into every inch of skin no matter how many layers of clothing. A truly stupendous amount of water was in the air. Relative humidity was at least 90%. It wasn't so much raining as raining. All that being said, a full third of the water on the Going Mary's deck was from tears, not precipitation. I have seen the hand of God, blubbered Sanji. I had seen traces of it before in the spray of the waves, the glory of the sunset and the majesty of a rainbow. I glimpsed it once across a great chasm when I was on the very brink of death. But now it stands before me, clear as day. I see it in the curve of thy cheek, the tightness of thy waist, the fullness of thy breasts. Thine is a beauty unparalleled throughout the world. Thou art perfection personified, a goddess among pitiful mortals unworthy of ye. Thy worth is beyond the scope of human understanding. One Piece itself would not merit even a second of thy time, a clipping of thy toenails, the lint of your navel. I am unmanned before such radiance. Thou hast slain me with but a look. I am brought to my knees by a whiff of thy scent. I am laid low by the divine music that is thy voice. So I say unto thee, I am yours. All that is mine shall be thine if you but ask. Should you ask for the rock that sits on the very top of the face of the highest mountain, I shall climb it without a second thought and leap from the summit that I may bring it to you sooner. I would bring you snow in the most burning desert, and fire in the most freezing tundra. Should you ask for my liver to be served as pate, I would gladly cut it out that you might savor it. Your every need I shall do my utmost to fulfill. And you need not do anything in return, for the sight of your splendor repays me 1,000, nay, 1,000,000 times over. Do with me what you will, for I am a humble worshipper of thy heavenly grace. My very soul is thine to command, for it was gratefully captured the moment I looked upon thy incomparable smile. I honestly don't know how to respond to that, Alvida answered. She'd never had a man literally genuflect before her, tears of joy pouring like a waterfall from an eye that somehow became a pink heart. She didn't know whether to keep one hand on her kanabo or tilt her hat to hide her blush. All I asked was your name. It's Bag O' Crap. family name Bag, middle initial O, personal name Crap. His parents had a terrible sense of humor, Zoro offered. Physical flames burst into being and wrapped around the blonde as he turned to face his rival. How dare you? He demanded, leg tensing to separate the swordsman's head from his torso. Is that really your name, Crap? Alvida asked timidly. If you want it to be, Alvida Swama, gushed the cook, back to prostrating and weeping. But as were not the only sobs to be heard. There is a god, and it's you, Usopp, praised Nami, hugging him around the waist after she'd fallen to her knees in shock. Like Sanji, her eyes had undergone a transformation once the waterworks began. But instead of an anatomically incorrect heart, they were Buri signs. Babies go for 100,000, adults for 500,000, cameras for 250,000, visuals and surveillance for 750, blacks with a starting bid of 1 million on the black market, whites for 5 million. And no installation charge if you can figure out how to build the rigs, which shouldn't be any trouble for a genius like you. And we'll be able to keep track of every single one and what they get up to. Plus, all the ones she's already had. So much information, all available to the highest bidder. I don't think she's had many, Usopp interrupted. The guy inherited her from his uncle, who supposedly found her in the wild and kept her as a pet. When he got her, he put on the rig and put her with the rest of his junk. When she wasn't bought within a month, he just kind of forgot about her. Doesn't matter. We're still set for life once Gaiman fixes her up and we get Luffy to tell us how to make her start churning them out. That snail is worth 3 gold mines and the mountains on top of them. And you got her for free. I have literally never been this happy. Nami tightened her arms, trying to squeeze Usopp to death to show her appreciation. Kaya stood with back straight, toes in line, hands held together at her waist, the picture of poise, though the ship swayed harshly with the waves. Her smile was wide, though she showed no teeth, her dimples emphasizing the upward curve of her mouth. Her eyes were closed, as if forced shut by how hard she was grinning. Her head was tilted to the side just so, giving her an air of sympathy and earnest interest in you and you alone. Her hair blew gently about her head as if from the wind, though all logic dictated it should be clinging wetly to her head. Nami-san, kindly stop nuzzling the source of my future children. It's beginning to irk me. Nami felt her stomach drop so hard it shot out her ass and ran away, screaming. In an instant she was on the other deck, waving her arms in a woe, not me manner, looking like she was trying to open the galley door with her foot. You must be mistaken, Kaya. There was no nuzzling. None at all. Kaya raised one delicate brow. And I just remembered that I don't want to touch Usopp ever again. He's got I can't go on that island or I'll die itis and I'd hate to catch it. Now, I think I need to take a second look at some maps, which I can read, because I'm the navigator, an irreplaceable, integral part to the crew whose absence would likely result in the death of everyone, whose potential disappearance would be noted, investigated, and any culprit dealt with by Luffy himself. What is wrong with this doorknob? Nami shouted, turning to focus her full attention on the uncooperative gateway to safety. I'll keep that in mind, she felt whispered into her ear. With a whimper, Nami finally got the door open and slammed it shut behind her so hard the porthole cracked. Kaya walked over to Usopp, face still frozen in its eerie beaming. Without warning, her hand thrust out to cup his crotch. Good boy. You didn't react to her. Of course not, mistress, Usopp answered calmly. I love you and only you, naturally. But don't think I've forgotten about that little moment of doubt earlier. We'll have to deal with that tonight. Usopp tried and failed to hide a wriggle of delight. Whatever you think is best. Mistress. He paused. Can I talk to Daisy now? She gets embarrassed whenever you come out in public. Oh, very well. Her eyes opened and her whole demeanor shifted. She looked down at her hand in confusion, but made no move to remove it. Oh dear, did she get possessive again? Just a tad. Nami just got carried away. No need to scare the poor girl to death. Besides, it's still daytime. She knows it's my turn. Has she no manners? Well, it probably doesn't help that you've started wearing the corset under your clothes. Kaya smirked. But of course, a lady should never go out without one. And you love being able to have both of us around all the time, don't deny it. Usopp grinned. Far from it. In fact, Kaya could feel just how much he loved it. She gave him a pat. Now, save it for later. Luffy just laughed. His crew was hilarious. Meanwhile, the rest of the armada was passing what little time remained before they reached Reverse Mountain. Gaiman felt like his right eyelid was trying to send a message in Morse code independent from his body. Would one of you clowns please stop laughing at me and fetch some lettuce so this poor, hungry, abused, idiotic, but still very special animal would stop chewing my hair? He roared at the buggy pirates and stitches over the side of the queen gnawing on the green fuzz she had mistaken for food. The captain of said pirates had most of his body on the big top while his head surveyed the blitz. Damn, this is quality craftsmanship here. Reminds me a bit of Captain Rogers' first boat before he got the Oro Jackson. Nice to see you guys settling in so quick. My boys are going to be glad of all the extra room, or rather the room they're getting back. Though what's with the name Blitz? Not that it isn't appropriate. You guys are having to actively restrain yourselves not to outpace us, I can see. But what's with the B? All the ships have B names. Big Top, Bezin Black, Bear 80, Blitz. Seriously, what's with that? Jin sighed. I don't know which disturbs me more, the fact that I'm actually talking to a floating head while sailing towards a place where water flows up instead of down under the command of a man made of rubber, or that I know that's not the weirdest thing this world has seen. Oh, you have no idea, Buggy commiserated. I'm sure going to miss normalcy. I was just starting to get used to it again. Momu swam next to the black cats, listening attentively to the voice of one man in particular. And then we'll take Madagascar. Always works in risk, and from there you and I will take over the world. Django, walking by at the moment, reached out and smacked the man on his head. Salem, stop filling that gullible creature's head with your fantasies of world domination. I don't care how much of the nip you smoke, you don't drag Captain Luffy's pets into your delusions. Oh ho ho ho, wailed the black cat. Try it again, and I'm cutting you off. Doi. Zeph was making liberal use of his toque to chastise his staff. Pedal faster, you fast food grease suckers. If you let this current drag us into the calm belt, I'll fry you up and feed you to the sea kings myself. HAI, owner Zeph, roared the 16 men in the basement, working at the stationary bikes that powered the propeller that supplemented what little wind the two masts caught given how small the sails were. With the weight of all the cooking equipment on board, every bit was needed to keep the Barady in pace with the armada. Zeph sighed and went back to looking through the periscope, adjusting the wheel as necessary to keep in formation. He mused that most of his former diners would be shocked at what had lain just beneath their feet. Submarines were rare in the East Blue, and that's what the basement looked like. All metal, with a pipe lowering from the ceiling that was actually just a spot for the two mirrors that allowed the one holding the wheel to see above the water. A child could make a rudimentary version with cardboard. 2 rows of 4 bikes were on either side of the wheel. At the front of the room, there was an airlock door that served as the entrance to the Sabagashira 1. Of the other 13 members of the staff, 10 were above deck adjusting the sails under the direction of Karn, who'd actually worked on a ship before and knew a thing or two about sailing and navigation. He was improving every day, with the lessons of Nami alongside Mo, Butchai, and Woj. The other 3 were either on the Big Top, Bezin Black, or the Blitz as part of the daily rotation. If the ship wasn't so small, Zeph might have considered training some more cooks so he could spread some of the work out. But it was, so he didn't. Any of his men who complained they were being overworked could jump overboard for all he cared. Nami came out of the galley, now wearing a raincoat. She pointedly didn't look at Kaya. She brought the megaphone Usopp technically owned but was really more crew property to her lips. Listen up, you morons. In case any of you forgot from the briefing yesterday, the entrance to the Grand Line is Reverse Mountain. The current is so strong that the canal will carry us up the side of the mountain. Those of you who don't believe that, too damn bad. You're still going to do everything I tell you so none of you crash into the red line. Now, once we get close the currents will be so strong that you can't turn, so it's critical that we enter just right. So saying, Nami seemed to go into a trance, looking between the sky and the ocean. Then she started to bark out orders. Buggy, close the main sails, open the foremast and the mizzen only. Black, 42 dig port for 183 seconds, then 17 dig to starboard. Dawn, full sail, you're going in first, but lower the jib, it's throwing you off. MOHMOO, get on the port side of the Barady and push. They're out of position. And you idiots, take in everything. Usopp, on my mark, go hard to starboard like you're trying to U-turn. Snap to it, people. And so it went. Nami micromanaged them all for the longest 23 minutes of the Armada's lives. When she at last called all hands at rest, a great many of the men collapsed in dead faints. She sighed and gave the Armada's ships one last look. They were all vaguely in a single file line, going Blitz, Mary, Barady, Bezin Black, Big Top, with Momu paddling in the rear. That's it. We're locked in. It's out of my hands now. Don't worry, Nami, Luffy called. I can just use balloon like last time if you got something wrong. No, you can't, she corrected. We're too close together, but this is as far as we can be within hearing range. By the time you bounce anyone back into line, the ones behind them will have crashed into them. It's all on me here. She frowned, trying to hide the sliver of doubt she had. She was 98.73% sure she'd gotten them all right, but there was always that 1.27%. Of course you got it perfect. Nami Swan. The Armada is safe and sound in your lovely hands, Melorine Sanji offered. Hi, she muttered. It went in one ear and out the other, but it brightened things up along the way. The navigator turned to consider the visibly puffing Alvida. Oi, new girl, haven't you ever worked a day in your life? Alvida leaned on her kanabo. In point of fact, no. My crew did everything for me. I might have the muscle to swing my club, but it's mostly done in one blow anyway. I don't really have much in the way of endurance. She went to wipe her brow and her arm was flung to the side so sharply she almost popped the joint. Doesn't help that I'm so damn slippery now. You'll get used to it. Luffy paused. Eventually, though it actually took me 10 years to adapt to my new body. But I'm sure you'll get it down quicker than that. If you say so, Alvida said faintly, pale at the idea that she could spend a full decade breaking in her new power. As they spoke, the clouds cleared a little. Almost as one, everyone turned and gaped. When it comes to some things, knowing and experiencing are two vastly different things. It was one thing to know that the red line was a uniform 10 kilometers in height, except for Reverse Mountain, which rose even higher than that. It was quite another to have it staring you in the face. Rock as far as the eye could see. As far to the left, as far to the right, as far up as you could look, nothing but red stone. You kind of strained your eyes looking for the end. Because there had to be an end. But it would be in vain. It just was. There was the ocean, and then there was the red line. It was as simple as that. A natural wall that encircled the planet. It had been there for thousands of years, and it would remain for thousands more. In the face of something so massive, so eternal, so unyielding, the trials of mankind seemed petty and fleeting. But just as nature had made the wall, it had also made a gate. In actuality, the width of the canal was just shy of a regulation football field. But considering the sheer scale of the edifice it was carved into, it seemed as thin as a hair. And they were approaching it at a rather dangerous rate of speed. It's taller than the clouds. Shemp gaped. At least Shanks isn't here to hear me scream like last time, Buggy assured himself. Demon, the Dawn Pirate staff officer of planning, gulped. You know, the marine genius Vegapunk defines insanity as attempting the same thing twice and expecting different results. Then I guess we're not insane, since this is nothing like last time. Pearl soothed. He was actually a bit of a people pleaser, always trying to make his crew feel better. It was probably just guilt from all the times he'd burned them with his bizarre defense mechanism, but still. Dom Luffy is a totally different man than Krieg, and if Nami-sama got it right, half of us won't crash and scupper against the cliffs like last time. Django gulped. Hey, we're off. We're going to slam right into that weird continent. Hard to port. Belay that. Butchai shouted with surprising authority. Django whirled on the larger of the Nyaban brothers. You challenging my authority as captain, Butchai? No, just asserting my authority as navigator. The endomorph shot back. It's my job to make sure this ship gets where it's supposed to go. And if we want to get to the Grand Line, we need to trust in Nami-sensei. Butchai jerked his chin at the canal. Just look, Captain, this current is strong enough to fight gravity. Our rudder won't stand a chance. At best, you'll break the wheel. At worst, you'll actually shift our course. And according to Nami-sensei, this is the course that gets us up that mountain alive. So we're staying course. Siam stepped up. What he said. If it helps, Captain, think of it this way. Black cats bring bad luck. Right now, it looks like we're trying to get ourselves killed. So of course we're going to get that 1 in a million chance and wind up surviving and screwing up our suicide. Django stroked his false beard. Sounds just weird enough to work. Zeph brought the two tails of his mustache together in his hand and stroked down. They sprung back with the sound of a spring. Back to paradise. And not to tour for a year, but as a stop on the way to the new world. Maybe I shouldn't have agreed to this in the heat of the moment. But a deal's a deal. And I might get to see all blue before I die, so I guess it's worth it. But I still have an urge to make the next feast vegan. The peddlers, on break since they were just going with the flow now, paled as they imagined Luffy's despair at a meal with no meat. Zeph nodded sagely at the haunted faces of his staff. Yeah, you're right, too much. I'll just slip hot sauce into everything and blame the lying eggplant. Momo tried to keep his breakfast in his first stomach. Sure, it was faster and safer than swimming through the calm water monster nest, but the mountain still scared him. At least if a bigger fish tried to eat him, he could try to swim away. This way, he had to struggle just to stay above water. The water had him. He sure hoped the orange female two legs knew what she was doing. Nami watched, heart in her mouth, as the fleet got closer and closer to the canal's entrance. Even as she saw them all shift and turn with the currents just as she'd predicted, she worried. Even as they aligned like clockwork until they were all but bowed astern, shooting straight as an arrow for the entrance, she worried. Even as they came so close to the sea gates she could make out individual carvings, she worried. Only when Momo made it past the final gate without so much as a bump did she breathe again. Luffy grinned so wide it would tear a normal person's skin. Hey, everyone, we're not dead. And it's all because of Nami. 3 cheers for our chief navigator and treasurer. Hip, hip, hooray, shouted the armada. Hip, hip, hooray, hip, hip. Who wants a raise? Buggy called out as a joke. Not on your life. The Buggy pirates very nearly considered mutiny. If they offered their ex-captain's corpse as tribute, maybe Nami wouldn't condemn them all due to guilt by association. The Barady chefs and black cats would have joined in. They were between Nami and her prey, after all. The Dons all heaved a sigh of relief, for they were not. The armada was distracted from contemplating said slaughter once it processed they were sailing up. Luffy HMM'd. Better than the roller coaster at Sabayati. Not as good as the knock-up stream. Are you seriously treating this like a thrill ride, Luffy-san? Kaya asked incredulously, clutching the railing with Usopp steadying her. That's just the way he is, Kaya-chan. Besides, you have to admit this is a little fun. Kaya furrowed her brow. It's about 10% fun, 70% sheer terror, 20% disbelief. And for Luffy, it's 99% fun, 1% mystery. Luffy frowned. That was the old me. Now it's like 75% fun. 18% been there, done that, and 7% trying to calculate velocity and distance in case Gramps asks. The couple hit identical sweat drops. Seriously, what did his grandpa do to him? They thought. Larry was bouncing like a little kid. We're getting closer to the clouds. I'll finally get to see if they really taste like cotton candy. Kabaji rolled his eyes. Can you believe that guy? He asked Moji. I know. Everyone knows clouds taste like marshmallow. Kadu held her hand to her forehead to block out the wind and rain. Huh, you can see Logtown from here. You think if we fell from this high up, we'd still land on our feet? Oliver asked Whiskers. On what? It's still the ocean, idiot. We'd drown. Think Zoro-sensei could cut this mountain in half? Asked the one who always wore his cat mask backwards. Patty tried to stiffen his upper lip and stop his knees knocking together. I am totally okay with this. This isn't at all scary. I don't want to curl up in the corner and suck my thumb until the bad dream goes away. Nope, not even a little. Mayasa pat him on the shoulder. Whatever you say, Tavarish. Hustle of the Dawn Pirates flexed his muscles. A nervous tick of his. It brought him back to simple days when he was just a gym rat and not a sea rat. Once more unto the breach, boys. Jin narrowed his eyes at the cloud bank. Next time we're under these, we'll be in the most dangerous place in the world. A devilish grin split his face. What better place to prove ourselves to the dawn? In no time, they reached the clouds. The world was nothing but cool fog for an endless moment. Then they all sailed through, and were treated to a site reserved for pirates and adventurers alone. The river they were riding into the sky came to an abrupt end when it clashed with its three siblings. The wash of each fought for dominance, sending spray up into the air in a never-ending battle. The water, once in the air, succumbed to the chill of the high atmosphere and crystallized into ice while still flying. Light bent and refracted through the makeshift prisms, resulting in a constant, shifting rainbow hanging around the summit like a halo. It truly was otherworldly. One by one, the ships that carried the many crews of Monkey D. Luffy shot into the air, passing through that icy mist and iridescent corona. It was almost baptismal, and one by one, they returned to the almighty grip of gravity, falling into the fifth canal, the only one going down. Momo roared as he hung suspended, his mighty cry sealing the event. They had done it. They had all entered the Grand Line. They had entered a whole new ocean, a world unlike any they'd left behind. The real adventure started now. If the ride up had been exhilarating, the ride down was an adrenaline junkie's dream come true. The angle was just as steep, and this time they weren't fighting the natural order. The quintet of ships reached speeds that were typically only accessible to advanced internal combustion engine. In a blink, they were back in the clouds. As they were in that eerie atmosphere, a sound of such amplitude it wasn't so much heard as felt hit them. BWOOH. Zoro frowned. Damn, Laboon's voice is so loud I can barely hear myself think. Alvida frowned. Who's Laboon? Are you talking about whatever the heck that was? It wasn't that loud. Laboon is a cute little whale we're about to meet. No need to worry, Alvida-sama, cooed Sanji. And Mosshead isn't talking about his physical voice, he added a bit more seriously. He regretted not lighting a cigarette before they got in this blasted wind. Guess you don't reach the size of some islands without picking up some psychic chops. Buggy fought a headwind so his Bara Bara emergency escape could reach the co-captain of his crew. You seem to have had a handle on everything so far, but just for my own peace of mind, you know about the island whale, right? Luffy grinned. Yep, and I know just how to deal with it. Buggy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He recognized that smile. It had preceded the real-life inspiration for most of his nightmares. BWOOH. Django tilted his head. What's that weird sound? Zeph frowned. Shitty whale better not be blocking the exit. The armada reached clear air once again, and were treated to the sight of a second mountain standing in their way, or something that looked very much like a mountain. What the hell is that? Shrieked one of the Dawn Pirates. Wait, you haven't seen him before? Usopp asked. No, and what do you mean him? Jin asked. The Tonfa wielder had his question answered by the creature in question rather than the liar. BWOOH. Hey, a whale, exclaimed almost the entire armada. It must have been under the surface when we came with Krieg. Pearl reasoned in the midst of panic. Gaiman was almost drooling. Now that is a special animal. To prepare a fresh whale steak, wash it in a solution of 1 generous tablespoon baking soda to 1 quart water and let it soak for 1 hour. Rinse the meat and marinate it for 2 hours in 3 parts water and 1 part vinegar, with a sliced raw onion. Cut the steak across the grain in slices less than half an inch thick. Sprinkle the slices with lemon juice and pound them with a mallet to tenderize them. Saute the steaks as you would sliced beef steak. Karm rattled off, his mind spitting up cooking instructions in the absence of any other idea how to process the situation. Momu cried. He was prey now. He was going to experience life on the other side of the food chain, and he was certain it wouldn't be a lengthy ordeal. Django had one hand in his jacket with an uncertain expression. Can I even hypnotize this thing to move if it can't see me? Anytime you're ready, Luffy. Nami sat back and waited for her captain to tame the massive beast as he had Surhom and get him to submerge. So she was sorely disappointed when instead he called out, in a voice that echoed and shook her very bones, "Oi, whale, eat me." "What?" came the full-throated cry of everyone but Luffy. The titanic mass of blue flesh shifted. Were it humanoid, the equivalent would be of tilting one's head. Eat me, you moron," Nami roared, downing her captain with her fist. Luffy looked up confused, and not just because of the concussion. "What? You told me to go ahead. I thought you were going to hit him with elephant gun or something and knock him out of the way. That comes later. First I want to talk to the old man Flower, or whatever his name is. That doesn't mean we have to get eaten." Nami added a few more lumps to her captain's skull. The one looked lonely. Alvida spoke up hesitantly. Nami, was it? Are you sure it's okay to hit Luffy-sama like that?" "Quiet, you." "Oh, wait, why didn't it slide off? Is it because it hit my hat?" "Pretty sure that's not the reason. The witch just has her ways," Zoro offered. While the core crew had been arguing, the whale had decided to go along with what the alpha voice told it to. Opening its gargantuan maw, the Armada's fate switched from slamming into a wall of blubber to sailing straight down a leviathan's throat. "Jin, what are you doing? Swerve around it already," demanded a freaking-out subordinate. Jin set his jaw. "If the Dawn wants to get eaten, we get eaten too." Talk about bad luck, sulked half the Black Cat crew, oddly resigned to the whole thing. Zeph was unfazed by the turn of events. "Got to get the recipe for that dip from Crocus this time around. Pretty sure it was just blended hummus and tapenade. But there was that certain something that gave an extra zing I could never figure out." "Captain Buggy, how are you so calm?" demanded Moji around, trying to pacify Richie in the midst of a mental breakdown. "Because I know we have nothing to fear," he replied. "Captain is so cool," thought the entirety of the crew. What they didn't see was Buggy crying silent tears. "Damn it, my ship is going to look so ugly. Nothing can get a nice varnish back in wood once it's soaked in stomach acid." Finally reaching sea level, but maintaining all their momentum, the Armada sailed right into the mouth of Laboon the whale. He closed his mouth behind the sea cow and hoped some would stick around. Krill got awfully boring after a while, but Flowerhead Friend always let out any interesting food. The Armada's world was darkness and rocking and god-awful stench. Then, out of nowhere, they were back outside. Wait, what? Those who weren't in the know began to doubt their sanity or speculate on what exact combination of things they'd ingested had resulted in hallucinations. Those that did had other things on their mind. "Crocus-sensei, please don't call me Nose-chan when you see me. I will be compelled to attack you and I don't want that on my conscience." Buggy tried to telepathically communicate to the resident of the little houseboat in the center of the sea of gastric juices. Sanji scratched his head as he brought his lighter to his mouth. Wow, that was a whole new kind of secondhand smoke. Now that I think about it, how is it light in here? It's not like Fishman Island, with Eve. We're in a stomach. Where's all this natural light coming from? Maybe a system of mirrors at the base of the blowhole that reflect light throughout the interior. Though they'd probably get knocked out of alignment every time Laboon smashed his head against the red line. More likely a bunch of well-placed lamp dials. Nami sighed. "This has been a long-ass day. I am not mentally prepared to deal with Vivi and that king wannabe. Can I just take a nap until dinner?" Luffy opened his mouth to answer, before freezing. Kaya took notice. "Luffy-san, what is it? Has your grandfather recovered and is coming for us?" Usopp hit a shiver. "Kaya-chan, leave the morbid comments and suggestions to Robin." "Well, she's not here yet, so I'm filling in. And it's a legitimate question." He froze up just like that earlier today. Luffy's mouth slowly spread into a grin so bright it almost hurt to look at it. "Are we just going to sit here in denial forever?" "Something happened already," shouted one of the Dawn Pirates who had gotten fed up listening to his friends insist they were experiencing a vivid, shared dream. As if on cue, a giant squid burst to the surface, tentacles flailing, and charged the Armada. "You had to ask," bit out Kijiko, the Dawn's quiet locksmith. Monster," cried the peanut gallery. The squid roared from its beak, eager to kill and feed. But suddenly, it froze in place. A ghostly voice began to echo around the chamber. "Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho." Zoro's grin did its level best to match Luffy's. "Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho." Usopp felt tears fill his eyes. "I can't believe it," he whispered. Nami's cheeks started to hurt. She just might show him her underwear this once. 100,000 up front, but still. "Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho." "Oh, come on. I said that as a joke. Is this for real?" demanded a flustered Sanji. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Buggy cocked his head. Where do I know this tune from? The squid seemed to simultaneously be torn to shreds and freeze solid. Where once was the latest thread to the straw hats, there was now just an oddly shaped iceberg. The sound of a shikama's way sliding back into its sheath was heard. Yo-ho-ho-ho. My, oh my. Everyone, you definitely are a sight for sore eyes. Oh, but I don't have eyes. Skull joke. Yo-ho-ho-ho. The armada turned their heads towards the Going Merry, where they espied one of the most horrifying scenes they could possibly imagine. A ghost. It's a zombie. It's a ghoul. It's the Grim Reaper. The time travelers only smiled and corrected them in one voice. It's Brook. In the Florian Triangle, a derelict galleon of considerable size floated listlessly in the water. Once, it might have been impressive, but 50 years of damp and neglect had worn it down to its bare bones. The sail was tattered and limp. Gaping holes stood out on its side. What would remain was both brittle with age and softened by the constant fog, resulting in a creaking surface liable to collapse under the slightest weight. The deck was deserted but for a single skeleton, the clothes wrapped around it in surprisingly good condition considering a corpse had decomposed within them. It was, in every sense of the word, a ghost ship, especially since the skeleton came to life and started to moan about a headache. Oh my aching head, he whined piteously. It's like Sanji-san tap dancing on my brain. Ah, but I don't have a brain anymore. Skull joke. Yo-ho-ho-ho. The skeleton waited a beat, then a sweat drop appeared on his afro at the lack of response. No one's laughing. That hurts me, guys. That really feels like a stab to the heart. Wait, but I don't have a heart. Skull joke. Yo-ho-ho-ho. Another beat. The sweat drop became a tick mark. Boy, people, this is my thing. Throw me a bone here, even though I'm nothing but bones. Dead silence. The skeleton rose up, his eye holes narrowed. I'm sorry, is it ignore Brook Day or? The undead musician froze. A light breeze blew, swirling the fog that clung like snakes to every surface. There was nothing, and no one, just silence and darkness, and him, alone, alone. No, 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 no. Brook felt like his was suffocating. He couldn't get any air to his lungs, except he didn't have. This wasn't the time for stupid jokes. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. Brook jumped to his feet and promptly ran into the mast at full speed. Oh, that hurt. Then this isn't a dream. Brook felt true panic set in. He desperately tried to make sense of his situation, because he couldn't be back on this ship. He could. Okay, Brook, let's be logical about this. You obviously just got hit by Kuma again. But didn't Lola-san get this ship? Okay, it wasn't that. But obviously you didn't just dream up Luffy and Usopp-san and Lion-chan. You couldn't. You're not that creative, are you? But you couldn't dream for 2 whole years. Could you? No, of course not. I saw so many places, made so many new songs, felt such joy, it had to be real. Right, but dreams can be anything you want them to be. No, I learned new things. You couldn't just make up that. If I can do them, then that's proof it was real. Brook leaned forward. Behold, the improved fortiding angle. Oof. Brook collapsed, his ligaments not stretched by a couple years of training anymore. Dread welled up and almost choked Brook. And no matter. Witnessed the flying blade attack. Obeyed Coop Droid. Brook unsheathed his sword and thrust it forward. But the blade was dull after 50 years, and he was too stressed to be in the proper mindset to exceed his physical limits with the power of his devil fruit. There was no compressed blast of air. Tears, snot, and drool began to leak from Brook's face. Horrible reality was settling in. He hadn't been found. He hadn't gained new nakama and had wonderful adventures. It was all a wild dream, and he would wander alone and forgotten in this shadowy sea forever. And he couldn't go back to that. Not after he'd seen so much light. Not after he'd felt it. But that hadn't even happened, had it? His sanity about to crack. Brook made one last desperate attempt to vindicate his memories or confirm that he was now truly mad. My soul is not bound to this body. Bone, bone, bone. It was impossible to properly describe the sensation. It was like transitioning from a sauna to a freezer, except that he didn't feel it on his skin, because he no longer had skin, or even a body to pretend to feel it. Walls that were so strong and constant that he never even noticed them, assuming them to be a simple part of being, vanished. He was left floating, adrift, a wisp in the wind, somehow both numb and freezing. His very essence had slipped free of the mortal form that anchored it to this reality. And it was wonderful. Yo, yo. Brook burst into hysterics. It's real, it's real. Yo. Brook sent his soul careening through the air, running into walls without fear, for he just passed through them. I really learned how to do this. Yo. Brook went through a couple loop-da-loops. That means I really met my new crew. Yo. Brook slipped back into his body and leapt his height into the air. So Laboon really is alive and well and waiting. Yo. Brook laughed so hard he cried. Then he cried so hard he began to laugh. Then he ran his hands through his magnificent afro to feel it there and whole. Then he just laid out on the deck, spread eagle, listening to the sounds of the ship he knew far too well. So, how did I get back here, Brook reviewed his memories, which proved much easier and more effective now that he wasn't on the verge of a complete psychotic break. We were running from the Marines. The Vegapunk man called us test subject. Everyone passed out from sleeping gas. Brook tried to recall anything before. Well, if he had to describe it, he'd say it was like being yanked in a direction that didn't exist. Oh, yes. Flux capacitor test number 22, begin. Brook wasn't exactly well versed in modern science. Nami and Usopp had tried to explain it to him whenever he asked, but they gave information based on basic things that he just didn't know. It was like trying to build a pyramid from the tip down. It just didn't work. Still, for some reason, the term flux capacitor rang a bell. Where have I heard that? Oh, it was when Usopp-sen was reading a book to Chopper-san about a man who had a machine that let him travel through time. Brook looked around at the second ship of the Rumbar pirates, and then down at his body and the clothes he'd worn for half a century and happily replaced once the long arms offered a new wardrobe. In what little light penetrated the eternal gloom and mist, it was still clear that Brook cast no shadow. He pulled on his hair, but his skull did not open like a lid. Well, that would certainly explain things. Seems like a bit less than 5 years. Now, what to do if it's true? Brook briefly considered just waiting however long it took for Luffy and the gang to come and find him again. The thought was enough to make him abandon his gentlemanly vocabulary in favor of something much more crude, but no less precise at conveying his thoughts. Fuck that noise. So what other options were there? Well, Brook wanted to be reunited with his Nakama as soon as possible, and it was his literal dying wish to be reunited with Laboon. When they'd first met, his crew had been too far along for him to ask them to just turn around. But if he really was in the past and at the point he theorized, then they weren't even in the Grand Line yet. But then again, when they entered they would be right where Laboon was. Everyone he loved, together in one place. Well, that certainly sounded like a good idea. But first things first, in order to leave the Florian Triangle without dissolving into dust, he had to reclaim his shadow, which meant he either had to get the Ruma zombie to swallow salt, or beat Gecko Moria into releasing the shadow. The first option was definitely the easier of the two. But Brook wasn't going to charge off this very second. As he recalled, Ryuma using his shadow was capable of defeating him with a fraction of his power. Most of the progress he had made over the 2 years had been the result of mental training, which in theory he already had. Still, he had to take care of a few things. Best not to run off half-cooked. The next 2 days were dedicated to preparations for the battle. The very first thing he did was go hunting through the ship galley to find all the powdered milk he could find. The stuff that had been fresh at the time of his death was moldy cheese by the time he found it 50 years ago, let alone by now. But powder kept forever, as long as it didn't get wet. And however clammy the surroundings were, the Rumbar pirates hadn't been stupid enough to skimp on preserving and packing their supplies. When he gathered all the usable packets he could find, he put them in a line next to an empty glass and then a pitcher of water he gathered from all the condensation. Then he disrobed. Ridiculous as it was, Brook still felt naked without his clothes. It was a bit redundant. He didn't even have a modesty to preserve anymore, a fact that had made Luffy, Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, and Frankie break down in sympathetic tears when they'd first realized. Even Zoro had frowned a little deeper. Robin had laughed her little laugh and Nami had rolled her eyes and muttered good riddance. Nonetheless, Brook felt a sense of embarrassment and shame to be walking around in nothing but his pelvis. Once the cloth was out of the way, Brook set about popping every single joint he had. Most he could just bend with his fingers, but some required complicated stretches to pull it just so. It was highly disturbing on some level when he grabbed his own spine. But Brook pushed on to stretch and twist the gap between every single vertebra. By the time he'd gone from the sciatica to his neck, he was almost 5 inches taller. He felt oddly drained once he was done, almost as if he'd pulled every muscle in his body, though of course he didn't have any muscles. A feeling that went away after he'd downed all the rehydrated calcium. Brook, of course, had thought of the skull joke about his muscles, but he didn't acknowledge it. One of the many revelations he'd had over his 2 years of training was that his little coping mechanism was actually one of the biggest things holding him back. Whenever confronted with the reality of his unnatural form, he deflected it with humor, but only by truly accepting it could he reach his true potential, something he strived to do in the mediation he did after he'd recovered from limbering up his body. Your body is not sustained by muscles, organs, or nutrients anymore. The only thing that animates you is the power of your soul, amplified by your devil fruit, he lectured to himself. He took a breath and paused. You think you actually breathed just now? No, you have no lungs to absorb the oxygen, no diaphragm to expand or contract them, no nose or mouth to direct the airflow, no brain to control the action. but you think you should breathe, and so your soul bent reality to move the air, draw it within, and absorb it into itself. The same way your soul absorbs food and somehow produces a waste product. And the only reason your soul does this is because, on some level, you still believe you are alive. You still believe you have a body, and that your body should behave and work how a body should. This is an illusion, one you must learn to transcend. You don't have to be tired, for fatigue is caused by the accumulation of tears and toxins within your muscles, which you don't have. You don't have to be slow, for speed is determined by how quick your muscles and tendons can flex, which you don't have. You don't have to be weak, for strength is nothing but the size and density of your muscles, which you don't have. All you have is your soul, your spirit, your will. If you believe it, if you accept it, if you know it, you can be invincible. Brooke pointedly did not inhale, though it had been minutes since he had. You have to let it all go, Brooke. Fear, doubt, and disbelief. Free your mind. Once he had reclaimed the zen and perception that had made him worthy of the new world, Brooke went down into the deepest part of the ship. He looked upon the coffins that contained the bodies of his first crew, the ones who had laughed, fought, and played beautiful music with him when he was a flesh and blood man. Forgive me, he pleaded into the air. Then, one by one, he began prying open the coffins. He'd buried each of them with their instrument of choice, their weapon, and any personal effects they'd kept on the ship. It took 17 tries before Brooke finally found what he was looking for. Tucked beside the ribcage of the crew's cellist, a whetstone. He muttered another apology, then spent the time needed to reseal each coffin he'd desecrated tirelessly and without complaint. After carefully sharpening his blade back to the razor edge it was meant to have instead of being barely sharper than a dinner knife, he went through the forms the assault squad of his kingdom had instilled in him before he decided on the life of a pirate. When he had completed every attack he knew to his standards, he turned to the sea. Reaching into the depths of his soul, Brooke focused on the otherworldly chill he always felt when his soul left his body, the chill that had plagued him for a year as he'd searched in vain for his own corpse. Then he harnessed it. Ice-spawn, moving faster than most could see. Brooke drew his sword and slashed down at the water, returning his blade to its hiding place and his cane in the same movement. Before his eyes, the water he'd aimed for froze, becoming a sheet of ice. It soon floated away, and Brooke was struck by the odd feeling that he might have altered the entire future with that one miniature iceberg. Solitary confinement was already getting to him, it seemed. His body put through its paces, his mind in the proper state, and his sword made as deadly as possible. There was only one thing left to do. Brooke lowered the makeshift pail into the ocean, then pulled it up. With great difficulty, given how much moisture there was in the air and the kindling, Brooke started up a fire in the ship's stove. It took a long time to build it up strong enough, but eventually the salt water began to bubble. There was really nothing Brooke could do to speed this along, so he decided to pass the time by writing a song. Something that captured the spirit of his nakama and their never-ending adventure. A big opening, something that grabbed your attention from the first note. Brooke imagined trumpets, drums, maybe some keyboard, with a guitar solo to lead from the first chorus into the actual song. Now, for lyrics. Let's go shining, running, forever. Divided by we have been moving forward before. I'm sure that our bonds will never have to change. The dream's end shines so brightly. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up heartbeat. Divided by we are the one. Go ahead. In Brooke's day, songs told stories and were basically poems set to music. These days, a 4-chord progression and some vaguely meaningful gibberish was all it took to have a hit. Brooke tried to bridge the two, but in order to get a tour that would bring him to Sabaody, he'd had to compromise more than he would like. By the time all the water had evaporated, Brooke had finished what he was pretty sure was a bestseller. Would he be able to sell music again? If he stopped Kami-chan from being kidnapped, Luffy would never punch the Celestial Dragon, which would mean that Kizaru and Kuma wouldn't come, which means the crew wouldn't be separated. But then how would they get strong enough for the new world? And what would happen to those poor Satan worshippers being terrorized by the Longarm tribe? A worry for another day. Brooke allowed himself to have air so he could blow out the flame. He looked in the pot and noticed a rim of salt at the bottom. Since he didn't have to worry about burns, he gathered it up and poured it into a little pouch he'd fashioned, as prepared as he could be. Brooke stepped out on deck and began to listen. He'd always had a prodigious sense of hearing. He'd been blessed with perfect pitch, and he had trained himself to be able to identify any tune even if it was through a wall. He'd been forced to exercise it quite a bit while working with his band. Or maybe it was more accurate to say he regained what he'd lost over 50 years of hearing nothing but his own voice. It got to the point that, if he concentrated, he imagined he could hear a person's heartbeat. This, combined with his ability to sense people's souls once he embraced his devil fruit powers, meant that he could find anyone as long as they were within a reasonable distance. On a map, it wasn't until after they'd left Dressrosa and he'd been having a discussion with Luffy and Zoro that it occurred to Brooke that he might have some form of observation hack. Indeed, it might even be enhanced by his ability, the way Enel had used electromagnetism to elevate his mantra. The point was that Brook was able to detect the faintest whisper of yo-ho-ho-ho, and he leapt from the ship and began running in that direction without any doubt. He eventually reached the outer rim of Thriller Bark. It took a while to go around and find the entrance, but once he did, he made straight for the transplanted island from his native blue, deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, and a big ruckus might attract the attention of Mariah and his officers. Brook stopped running once he cleared the land moat and reached the forest, moving with all the stealth he was capable, and desperately trying to clamp down the irrational fear he felt whenever he saw a zombie. Brook made his way to the castle. After a full minute straining his hearing, he managed to pinpoint the laugh that both was and wasn't his. As if it were fate, the zombie was in the same tower that they'd had their final confrontation, though technically this would be the first. Brook frowned. The castle was buzzing with activity. He didn't have enough salt to purify every zombie that got in his way. He had to make it straight for Ruma. But how to get there? It wasn't like he could run up. Or could he? Going with his gut, a habit he'd picked up from Luffy, Brook ran straight for the wall of the castle. Then he put his foot on the stone and shifted direction. Brook began to make his way up the wall, in defiance of gravity. In his wake, he left little spots of ice, each step he made freezing the water in the air around his shoe and adhering him to the surface, before he broke free to make the next. In short order, Brook had entered the tower from its highest window. He stepped out into the open room, his sword already drawn. The room's other occupant turned to regard him. "Oh, who are you? You seem quite frightening, even for this place." Yo-ho-ho-ho. Brook kept an ironclad grip on his feelings, keeping himself as cold as the underworld he had escaped. "I have come to take back what is mine." The zombie tilted its head. Its white hair was tied in a top knot, its face mostly covered by bandages. Its mouth was partially hidden by a large blue scarf wrapped around him. The desiccated body all but vanished into the folds of the white gi. A blue haramaki with a wave design wrapped around its waist, with a sword tucked into it at the right hip. Its brown, wrinkled feet wore Geta sandals, and beneath those feet lay a pool of darkness that was not its own. One of those. Well, I'm afraid I can't help you with that. You see, it's my shadow now, so it's best if you just walk away now and learn to live without it." Brook narrowed his eye sockets, an act that spoke more to the sheer game-breaking nature of his fruit than the flexibility of his skull. "I wasn't planning on asking." The zombie laughed with a throat dry as dust. "Yo-ho-ho-ho, so that's how it is." The body of Rima of Wano country drew its sword. "I can't kill you, that would just make your shadow disappear. But I'm sure I can knock you around a little to teach you a lesson." Brook made no response. There was no honor in taunting one's opponent. Sedately, the two began to walk towards each other. Nothing in their posture or gait suggested hostility. As they passed each other, they each began to sheathe their blades. Once they were both 3 meters from each other, they stopped. "Hanada Sancho," Rima stated, sliding his sword fully in with a click. "Yahezu Jerry, Kasaryuda," Brook called, surprising his enemy. The skeleton smoothly turned his sword back into a cane. "Fubuki Jerry." A beat. Brook seemed unharmed. Rima seemed to split in two, before ice formed from nothing to hold him back together. He collapsed to the ground, the ice spreading until nothing but his head was free. The zombie looked up in horror and disbelief. "What? How did you do that?" "I know everything you know. You shouldn't be able to do anything like this." Brook declined to answer. "The cold you feel is the chill of the underworld," he intoned. He knelt down and dumped his pouch's contents into his enemy's gaping mouth. "Return to its embrace and leave this world to the living." The samurai coughed around the shadow that began to leak out its mouth. "Like you're one to talk," it managed before becoming nothing but a cadaver. Brook breathed deep the smell of death and decay that pervaded the castle. He reached up to straighten the silk of his neckerchief, savoring the smoothness. He looked down and watched as his outline reattached to his feet and a sense of completeness suffused him. And he felt warmth fill his breast as he thought of the friends he would soon see again. "I'm alive in every way that matters." At the Twin Capes. "And that's pretty much it," Brook explained, after he'd recovered from the dogpile of straw hat pirates that had launched at him after he'd revealed himself. "I mean, there was the part where I scaled the red line and ran along it until I finally reached Reverse Mountain. But that wasn't really that interesting. Most boring 2 weeks of my life. I came down, met Laboon, got him to recognize me, played the tone dial, and ever since I've been living here waiting for you." Brook turned to Luffy and lifted his hat. "Many thanks for your message in the newspaper, Luffy-san. It put to rest many of my fears. I was worried that should I have met you again this early, you would not want me on the crew." Luffy laughed at the absurdity. "Shishishishi, Brook, I wanted a musician since I set out. Before I met Zoro, even. Old me would have taken you along in a heartbeat. Oh, that makes my heart flutter. Except my heart can't flutter, since I don't have one." Skull joke. Yo-ho-ho-ho. Usopp was all but hopping with glee. Man, I can't tell you how much I miss those. Great to have you back, Brooke. Kaya stood awkwardly behind her boyfriend. I'll be perfectly honest, the sight of you terrifies me. But Usopp-kun likes you, so I'll try my best to get used to it. Brooke looked down from his 9 feet to regard the petite blonde. Oh, I don't believe we've met. He stepped forward and leaned down so they were face to face. Excuse me, but may I see your... Brooke was interrupted by the sound of a slingshot being drawn. Based on the tone of the powder grains shifting within it, the musician guessed that the star was of the incendiary variety. Also, by the position and timing of the elastic, he reasoned the sniper was aiming at his head, or rather his hair. And the soul of the girl he was about to proposition suddenly reached a raw frigidity that made the winds of the afterlife seem like a summer island heat wave. Yet her smile did not waver. Brooke gulped. Never mind. He backed slowly away from the girl, whom tucked her head beneath Usopp's in a very telling way. The look in his Nakama's eyes might as well have come with subtitles. She's off limits. Not that Brooke would have followed through even if she weren't involved with the long-nosed boy. He had some self-preservation instinct. He turned his attention on the other woman on board the ship he didn't recognize. She really was quite lovely, and wasn't obviously recoiling at him. Ah, miss, I haven't had the pleasure of your acquaintance either. She offered a weak grin. I'm Alvida. Nice to meet you, Brooke-san. Nice to meet you too, Alvida-san. Brooke leaned forward and whispered conspiratorially. Beg your pardon, but may I see your panties? Her face went red as a tomato. I want to do more kind deeds. Still, I'm not sure if that's appropriate. Or am I just being selfish? Brooke was surprised. She hadn't immediately said no. That was almost as good as Shaki-san telling him the color of hers. Before Alvida could decide, Sanji answered for her. Of course she won't, you imbecile. The lovely Alvida Swama would never expose herself for a pervert like you. Shitty pervert. Shit, shit, shit. Each expletive was accompanied by a kick. Yo-ho-ho-ho. Brooke laughed off the assault. He turned to the navigator of the crew. Nami-san, I don't suppose. All cash, exact charge, no checks or credit, she replied with a straight face. The tallest member of the crew heaved a sigh. Oh, well. The Armada had stayed quiet up to that point, pacified by the fact that the core crew seemed to recognize the monster and that they were obviously deep in conversation. But there was only so long one could leave the elephant in the room unattended. Don, called Pearl, who was crouching so he was all but hidden from sight by his breastplate. Care to introduce us to your friend? Luffy suddenly remembered that he had more than just the one crew. Oh, right. Luffy hopped onto his special seat and waved an arm at Brooke. Everyone, meet Brooke, my personal musician, joining us ahead of schedule. Django cleared his throat. And exactly how is this weirdo a walking, talking skeleton? Devil fruit, was the deadpan response of the whole core Straw Hat crew and half the buggy pirates. Zeph narrowed his eyes. Nothing to cook, though maybe bone marrow soup. Karn side-eyed his boss. I'm not sure that counts as cannibalism, but you do know you're assessing a member of Luffy-sama's crew, right? Yes, I do. The same way I know that the Zestrich's eggs would make a damn fine omelet. One has to think about these things. Never know when you'll run out of supplies and have to get creative on this wide ocean. A certain emergency food supply 3 islands away felt his first stand on end. The crew were distracted from the member of the undead whom was apparently on their side by the door of the cottage opening. From the darkness within emerged a curious individual. He was old, at least in his late 60 seconds, as evidenced by the white of his beard and the wrinkles of his face. He wore a colorful tropical shirt and khaki shorts. A scar stood out at his left elbow. Curiously, live flower petals seemed to be growing in a semicircle out of his head. He regarded them all with a distant stare behind simple lenses. A great many of the men felt their hearts begin to race. Something was just off about this guy. The way he glared at them, as if he were deciding whether or not to kill them, like they were invaders, like they were bugs to be crushed at his leisure. It was most disquieting. He stared, and stared, and stared, until he plopped his ass down in a lounge chair and opened the paper. Say something, damn it. The man looked up from the paper, looking vaguely annoyed. One of the jumpier members of the buggy crew spoke up. Boy, don't you look at us like that, 'cause we have cannons. And we're not afraid to use them. The man's eyes widened and hardened, locking his gaze on the man in the ship he was on. Said loudmouths Nakama nearly soiled themselves from the intensity of the glower. He stared, and stared, and stared, until, don't, or someone will die. The buggy crew not so subtly reached for their weapons. The guy who'd started this mess swallowed and reached for what little bravado he could muster. Yeah, who'd that be? Me, of course. Are you kidding me? Roared the clowns. One among the black cats decided that some feline grace and poise was in order. Pardon me, sir, but could you tell us who you are and where we are? The stranger shifted his eyes towards the black besom, and every one of her crew felt like they lost one of their 9 lives from the look alone. He stared, and stared, and stared, until, if you want something from someone, it's proper manners to introduce yourself. The feline peon gulped. My bad. Let's see, my name is Jijian. I am Crocus. I am keeper of the Twin Capes Lighthouse. I am 71 years old, Gemini, blood type Ab, or XF if you prefer. Let me at him, yelled the catty pirate, held back from scratching the man to shreds by his comrades. And you want to know where you are? I should think that would be obvious. Do you think this is a rat's stomach? Those who'd been in denial over the fact they'd been eaten promptly lost their shit, but they don't deserve the screen time to describe it. Jin narrowed his eyes and eyed the sky above them. If this is a whale's stomach, how come it looks like the outside? He stared, and stared, and stared, until, would you cut that out? Howled 90% of the armada. Luffy laughed. He hadn't been around for this last time. Shishishishi, can't you guys appreciate a good running gag? That was a gag. Crocus inclined his head at Luffy. The brat with the hat has a good sense of humor. He flicked his eyes back to Jin. And call it an old man's pastime. Buggy had dreaded his childhood nickname returning, but he was starting to feel put out that he'd been ignored this long. Hey, Crocus-sensei, do you remember me? He stared, and, screw it, it's not funny anymore. Oh yes, weren't you one of the ankle biters on that ship I worked on a few years back? Like knives and treasure. Had a crush on that other red-haired kid. Buggy felt like the ground dropped out beneath him. Oh wait, that was just him falling to pieces. He kept his head afloat to scream his lungs out at Crocus. Are you censored kidding me? Censored you, old censored man. ID not censored that censored for a full minute shanks. I hope he censored dies and censored for graphic violence and censored for disturbing imagery while I censored for you don't even want to know, and it will be the most delicious soup I will ever have in my life. Even the whale was shocked into silence, and he didn't even hear it. Damn, muttered Zoro. Gaiman hesitantly brought down his hands from where they'd been guarding the Queen Den Mush's ears. I only heard half of that and I'm still as appalled as I am impressed, commented Kadu. I am suddenly glad I am no good with this language. Patty only nodded and patted my ass on the back. Siam raised a shaking hand. Captain, permission to be hypnotized into getting those disgusting images wiped from my brain. You read my mind. I was about to do it to myself. Anyone else want to join in? 95 hands went up in the air. And I thought Hawkeye's was cruel. Marveled Jin at his own naivete. Crocus hadn't even blinked. Sorry, my mistake. That, more than anything, proved he was a veteran of the New World. A dazed moment of silence left in the wake of Buggy's crimes against decency. The spoken word, and pretty much the entire human race to the 13th generation, was broken by the sound of a door slamming open. A steel door, incongruously set in the middle of the horizon, burst open to reveal a male Jesse and female James, sans Meowth. They raised identical bazookas and called out "Bye-bye, baby," before they could fire. A force as mysterious and undeniable as gravity swept through the stomach. Some of the weaker members of the armada passed out, while most developed cold sweats. A precious few remained unaffected, and the two strangers fell over the edge of the platform they'd stood on, foaming at the mouth, their weapons falling from limp fingers into the sea of chloride-based acid to eventually dissolve. Before the two could suffer the same fate, two hands stretched out to grab them from midair and drag them to the deck of the Going Merry. They did not have a gentle landing, but Luffy didn't seem to care. The stretchy pirate turned to Crocus. Sorry about that. We'll deal with these two. Mind letting us all out? I don't want my ships to get digested. Crocus regarded Luffy silently. Were one especially gifted at lip reading, they might have made out what is with that hat. Then he got out of his chair. You're cutting into my vacation time, but fine. In short order, the armada were sailing through a tunnel that, if Crocus was to believe, he had carved himself through the innards of the whale, who was named Laboon, by the way, and was considered a nakama in full, not just a pet, of the skeleton musician. Crocus fielded all questions with little complaint while the Straw Hats had their own discussion. It was quite a shock to see how big he had grown. I heard that island whales never stop growing, but the last time I saw him he was barely big enough for me to ride him. Yeah, I'm fairly certain he's the biggest living thing we've ever seen. Nami mused. I mean, you could lose the Mary and his pupil, for inflation's sake. Hey, I don't know. That turtle thing that showed up before Jaya was pretty huge, Usopp argued back. Serum was only about as big as that Oz bastard. But with his arms he felt bigger, since he could move all around, Luffy chimed in. Hey, who'd win in a fight, Laboon or that goldfish at Little Garden? The two most normal members of the crew felt their blood freeze. Let's not find out, they both stated firmly. Luffy pouted. Aw, come on, it would be awesome to watch. Brook hit a sweat drop. Luffy-san, I'd rather Laboon not fight at all. I mean, I'm sure he can take care of himself, but he's been hurting himself for decades because I couldn't keep my promise to him. I don't want him to suffer any more pain. Luffy frowned, but he nodded. In short order, the armada was back in natural sunlight, and Crocus stayed back to reseal the hatch in his patient sigh. At Luffy's command, everyone docked at the lighthouses. They'd have a victory dinner, get some rest, and set out in the morning. Same as last time, just with a lot more people. Sanji paused before he entered the galley. Listen to me now, Shitty. Eat every bite of the elephant tuna again before the ladies can have a taste, and we will have words. Luffy shrugged. Can't be any worse than the ones Gramps had with me, but sure, I'll eat slowly. Though I thought you guys actually liked it better when I gorged myself. You all give me weird looks when we eat now. Sanji opened his mouth to respond, then he closed it. There's no winning with you, he muttered darkly before going inside to cook, while everyone who wasn't cooking was just lounging, trying to relax after a very, very long day. Brook noticed Laboon looking at him. Since it required significant effort to align his head to look at anyone, Laboon wouldn't go to the trouble for just anything. Brook chuckled. Okay, dear friend, it has been a while since the last time. The Revenant walked into Crocus's house and emerged with a violin and bow. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a white conch shell. He offered it to Luffy, who took it with a grin. Then, when he'd gotten his instrument in position and laid the horsehair to the strings in preparation, Brook nodded. With care, Luffy clicked the button on the tone dial. Cheerful piano and strings began to emit from the shell, the quality of the recording such that it was like there were an invisible orchestra there on the cape. Brook easily matched pace, adding a vibrant counter-melody to the music. Buggy snapped his fingers. Now I remember. This is that old shanty. Captain Roger loved it. The clown's face shifted as if he'd been forced to swallow excrement. So did Shanks, he hissed. Luffy carefully set the dial on the ground before issuing a decree. Everyone, time to get this party started. If you know the words, sing along. If you don't, dance and clap. This is the anthem of pirates like us. Brook only smiled and broke out into song. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Bainkusu no seikwo, tadok nai yuku yo. Yumakazi kimakase namamakase. Shio no mukuda, yuyuhimo sawago. Sora naya wawo kaku, tori no yuda. Sayonara minato, tsumugi no sato yo. Don to aiku yudao, funade no yuda. Kinpa jinpa mo shibuki nai kit. Oritacha yukuzo, yumi no kajiri. Laboon was bobbing up and down in the water, sending waves that crashed against the cliffs and soaked a few of the men near the edge. But the crinkle of his eye and the wide smile on his face made it clear he was happy as a clam. The sheer emotion and mastery of his craft that Brook and the memory of his crew put into every note had everyone on their feet. Barely a third of the men were actually singing along. But Luffy's boisterous, if toneless, tenor carried enough weight for all of them. Bainkusu no seikwo, tadok nai yuku yo. Wera kaizoku, yumi wataku. Nami wo makura nai, nagura wa funyo. Ho nai hata nai keditaru wa dokuro. Arashi ga kitazo, senri no sora nai. Nami ga otaruyo, doramu nares. Okabao kazi nai fukaria sego. Asu no asahi ga nai yon nashi. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. The music died down to a solo. And as if on cue, everyone quieted down to let Brook take center stage. Bainkusu no seikwo, tadok nai yuku yo. Kaiwu ka asu kata yoi no yum. Ti wo furukage nai, mui nai yo. Nani wo kyokuyo, asu motsukuyo. The tone became cheery again and Luffy brought everyone roaring back in for the finale. Bainkusu no seikwo, tadok nai yuku yo. Don to aiku yudao, unaban no yuda. Daus dare demo itsuka wa hon yo. Eight nashi, waribanashi. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Yo-ho-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho-ho. Everyone started to cheer, their spirits uplifted and bodies energized as if they'd been exposed to some kind of drug. And despite their deafening volume, there was no word for the sounds coming from Laboon other than squeals. Then he clamored for an encore, and Brook was happy to oblige. He did it without the tone dial, so others improvised their own instruments from random junk. It was much less refined, but it was somehow more real. Luffy walked away from the heart of the revelry to the edge of the cliff. He looked up at Laboon, and the captain felt when he got the whale's attention. Last time Brook left, he and his crew left you behind because you were still too small. Now, he's going to come with us, and you're no longer a child. Luffy grinned. Laboon, would you like to come with us as we cross the Grand Line? The whale reared back and roared his approval. BWOOH. Luffy nodded. Then he cocked his head. Huh, how are we going to get the Jolly Roger on you? If I do it, it'll suck. But I'm the only one who can stretch to reach you. In the middle of all the shenanigans, the two would-be whalers awoke from their induced slumber. They tried to stretch, only to find they were wrapped in rope. With some very impressive knot work, but that was lost on them. What's going on, Mr. 9? I don't know, Miss Wednesday. The last I remember was getting ready to shoot the whale's stomach. Yeah, about that, called out a strong female voice. They looked up to see a woman wearing not but a bikini and jeans, her garnet locks flowing to her waist. Our captain likes this whale, and he hates people who won't face people in a straight fight. Not a fair fight, but at least going head to head instead of using poison or sneaking around. He wasn't going to let you perforate him from the inside. Miss Wednesday, thinking fast, tried to play the sympathy card. Please, you don't understand. Our town is having a food shortage. People are starving to death, with no idea what to do. This whale would feed everyone for 2 years at least. That whale is the salvation of Whiskey Peak. Would you condemn over 100 innocent people to death for some animal? The woman rolled her eyes. Tell it to someone who cares, sweetheart. Besides, innocent is a strong word to use around Whiskey Peak, what with it being a bounty trap run by Baroque Works and all. The two frontier agents were gobsmacked. These rookies knew about their organization. Mr. Nine tested his bindings nervously. If you know who we are, what exactly are you planning to do with us? Their captor raised a brow. Isn't it obvious? You're our hostages. What? The party really was something. Once the men had time to recover from the fact that, yes, they had technically been eaten, they realized that they were now in the Grand Line. All their training and preparations had come to fruition, and they were finally there. It was both a celebration of all that had led them to that point, and the kickoff for the start of a whole new journey. Several things happened during that party. Oh, I almost forgot, Brooke exclaimed. He ran over to Crocus's houseboat and emerged carrying a familiar black sheath. I grabbed this for you, Zoro-san. I remembered how much stronger you were once you got it. Zoro grinned like a shark as he felt the heavy weight of Shisui in his hands. Welcome back, he muttered. After thanking Brooke, Zoro reached down to belt the sword only to realize his dilemma. Right. Well, I suppose I could work on making a Yontaryu. No, it wouldn't be ready anytime soon. So, one of you has to go, it seems. Zoro thought about it a second. He would die before losing Wado, and Sandai Kaitsu was too dangerous for anyone but him. Yubashiri it is. At least you didn't have to die this time. Zoro used observation for a second, and walked over to Kaya. Boy, you want a decent sword instead of that mass-produced junk? Kaya's mouth twisted into a mow of annoyance. My father commissioned this sword. The blade is folded steel. Gold filigree is laid into the handle, and it's perfectly balanced since the tang is nearly the full width of the blade. Zoro winced, but didn't start to fear for his life. This was Daisy, not Mistress. He'd learned to tell the difference for the sake of survival. It was like dealing with that Cavendish person. Sorry, what I meant is, would you like Yubashiri? Kaya regarded the katana for a moment before shaking her head. No, thank you. Not my style. If I must get a better sword at one point, I'd prefer it be that elephant Zoan that horrendous leader of CP9 has. Usopp-kun made it sound so cute. Fair enough. Moving to the next candidate. Zoro found him holding his own sword in his teeth while balancing on his unicycle to the cheers of a crowd. Kabaji. In an instant, the swordsman of the buggy crew was at attention and his sword sheathed, his unicycle falling to the side behind him. Yes, Zoro-sensei. Zoro felt a twinge of annoyance. He wanted them to respect him as a teacher, but most of his students' abject worship was just plain bothersome. Still, that was what you get when you claimed the title of world's strongest swordsman before their very eyes. Zoro held out the lacquered ebony of his lightest blade sheath. Brooke brought me one of my old swords, so I have one extra. You want it? A hush seemed to fall over their part of the party. Are you serious? Kabaji asked, his eyes almost popping out of his head. The group that had been watching his antics had their jaws around their waists. Zoro shrugged. You're my best student. You deserve a decent sword. What, you don't want it? No. If you think I'm worthy of it, I'll gladly take it. Kabaji reached out and practically snatched it. He then looked down at it in reverential wonder, actually falling to his knees. This blade has drawn the blood of Mihawk, and he saw fit to bestow it upon me. This is an immeasurable honor. I shall treasure it all my life, as will my sons, and their sons, and God willing, their sons throughout the ages. This is my legacy. One of the last beams of light from the setting sun seemed to fall upon the chief of staff. The men around him looked at him with awe, as if they were witnessing a miracle. They one and all bowed their heads, thanking their lucky stars that they were able to bask in this holiest of moments. This rare and priceless treasure, the realization of a man's romance. Zoro's sweat drop reached past his hair. Right. Where's the alcohol? Again. Usopp adjusted the magnification on his goggles. Okay, a little more to the left. You want it to be a gentle sweeping motion. All right, just a gentle sweep. Careful of the angle. Luffy huffed and side-eyed his sniper. Do we really have to keep working on it? It's recognizable, that's good enough, right? Hey, you're the one that wanted to make him our official mascot. People will see this image and associate it forever in their minds with the Straw Hat Armada. That's not something you half-ass. Besides, we've already been doing this for 2 hours. What's a few more minutes? Luffy looked longingly at the table Sanji had set up. But the girls are eating all that cool elephant tuna. There's not going to be any left for me at this rate. Come on, I'm hungry. Usopp got an evil glint in his eye. Okay, sure, you can leave it like that. Just know that you'd be leaving your Jolly Roger, the pride and heart of our crew, behind. Just know that you'd have forever marred the face of one of our cherished Nakama by leaving your work unfinished. What would Shanks think of you doing something like that to a friend, I wonder? Luffy had gone very still. Usopp smiled victoriously. So which will it be, Luffy? Your heart or your stomach? Hat shadowed his face. His whole body quivered as two of his most fundamental desires clashed. His internal war made Marineford look like a classroom debate. Well played, Gatsby. Well played, Luffy ground out. The third mate frowned. Don't call me that. Only Kaya-chan gets to call me that. I could call you some of the other things she does, but Nami told me they're not appropriate for civilized conversation, whatever that means. Say, what is a maso? Wow, it's getting late. And our dinner's getting cold. What say we finish this up, huh? Usopp interrupted, his soul all but floating out of his mouth as his captain almost asked him about that part of his life. Laboon just hummed, waiting for them to finish so the paint could dry and he could go get some food. Game oh so softly tried to coax the queen to drink from a bottle. She looked a little better already, but years of neglect couldn't be undone in half a day. She looked ready to drop, even though she'd barely done anything. She hadn't had to even move since they'd gotten her. Deciding that maybe rest would be for the best, Gaiman pulled back the water. The party was getting a little loud, so he leaned in close to sing a lullaby he'd used on all the animals at one point. If I had words to make a day for you, he crooned, I'd sing you a morning. Golden and true, he gently petted her head. I would make this day last for all time. Her eyes were already starting to close. Give you a night deep in moonshine. That was beautiful. Gaiman jumped, turning to see the freaky skeleton that the captain liked so much. Gaiman felt it easier to think of it as some sort of exotic creature than a true blue member of the undead. He coughed and tried to hide his blush. It was nothing. No, I'm serious. You have a very nice voice, such a sweet timbre, and something about that song just speaks to you, you know. I could practically hear the orchestra swell. Or maybe a bass guitar and jazz organ. Oh, where are my manners? I am Brook, the musician. And who might you be? Gaiman regarded the hand held out to him warily before leaning to grab it with his own immobilized one. Gaiman, the zookeeper. Brook gave a simple shake before retreating a step. I must confess, I was a little scared to come talk to you, but I couldn't resist the music. Gaiman raised a corner of his unibrow. I scared you. Well, yes. I've never seen someone in a box. I keep waiting for you to jump out and attack or something. Oh, the irony, Gaiman thought. A little ways away, Momo was still shivering. He had the strongest reaction to being introduced to Laboon's digestive tract. He had sought out the black cat he'd been listening to earlier, who was currently patting his head. Hey you guys. I think I'm his favorite, Salem said to his buddies. I'll alert the media. Saberhagen, one of them deadpanned. It's pronounced media. Meanwhile, the Kangasero's cub was in a bouncing contest with Tygefant beneath the watchful eye of his mother while the bear pig ate honey between cowering at the tremors and the rabble tried to break up the foolishness in order to demonstrate proper technique with the donkver watched morosely, making a whistling sound as it breathed through its gapped teeth. In an alternate dimension, the sentient stuffed animals of a certain British schoolboy took a moment from playing in their hectare woodland to sneeze. Nami finished the last bite of her fillet. Say what you will about Sanji and his many, many flaws, but the man could cook. Besides, this was a prime ingredient in the first place. She could almost forgive Luffy for eating it all to the bones last time. Almost. Hey, aren't we going to get anything? Whined a certain undercover princess. Nami glanced at Miss Wednesday. She loved Vivi, she really did, but she sure could be a bitch while she was in character. You have water and rice, don't you? That's not food. That's barely a snack. Though the closest thing to a saint that Nami was ever likely to meet in her lifetime. It would seem Vivi hadn't gone through a royal upbringing without becoming a little spoiled. Tough, that's all you're getting. Though Sanji would probably whip up a 5-course meal if she managed to ask him directly. The frontier agent grit her teeth. Cold, heartless bitch, she muttered. I'm not a cold, heartless bitch, Nami countered. I'm the cold, heartless bitch. Mr. Nine spoke up. Look, we're really not that valuable to our organization. We're barely above the bottom, to tell the truth. It's highly doubtful that they'll shell out anything for us. And if you're planning on using us as shields or something, you should know that Baroque Works thinks nothing of disposing of members to fulfill the mission. So, really, you'd be better off if you just let us go. Nami gave him a flat look. You'd still keep the bullets off us if they fire. And I think you're more valuable than you think. I'm pretty sure I can get a billion for your little partner alone. The acrobatic baseball enthusiast felt his whole body turn white. What kind of woman was this? There's a special spot in hell reserved just for you, he hissed. Yes, there is. It's called a throne. Nami-san. Nami looked away from her horrified captives to look at Kaya. She tried not to jump. She was the scariest girl on the crew. Not Kaya. Kaya was an amateur, a newcomer. She had no idea what Nami could dish out. She didn't bat an eye at the monster trio in a tantrum. She wasn't going to be cowed by some pampered slip of a girl. Denial ain't just a river in Arabasta. What is it? Kaya looked contrite. Listen, I know that I've put you through a lot with my and Usopp-kun's, activities. And even though I paid you, it still feels like I've been taking advantage of you and just being rude anyway. And now that Alvida-san has joined the crew, it just seems far too selfish of me to kick you all out for my sake. So I'd just like to inform you that I relinquish my, bedroom privileges. You will be able to go to bed whenever you want without fear or disgust. My sincerest apologies for all your discomfort up to this point. That's great. Nami smiled, her tone grateful and bubbly. In the same voice, she asked what's the real reason. Kaya's eyes slid closed with a smile, and her entire aura shifted. I've decided to explore the thrills of exhibitionism and the fear of getting caught by defiling every other room and surface on my ship. Once that wears off, I'll impose a ban so that we can only do it on islands. I figure if I deny my little boy and have him bottle it up, it will be even more fun when I allow him to let loose. Good for you, Nami replied, her face green but still smiling. I had to ask. I never would have pegged Usopp as that kind of guy. Maybe she just bullied him into it. And just for the record, Nami-san, I want you to know that I am not a bully. I discipline because I care. Nami felt her blood run cold. This was the sniveling girl that couldn't bring herself to fire a gun at a man she thought had killed a friend and betrayed her. Love brings out the best in all of us, don't you think? The former heiress said airily. Well, that was all the confirmation she needed to never ever fall in love. In fact, a life without love is hardly worth living, I think. Was that a threat? But that's just my opinion. Taking pity on the navigator, Kaya turned to regard the hostages. Are these two giving you any grief? Nami felt her mouth spread into a smile that would make the devil himself whimper like a puppy. Her schadenfreude senses were tingling. Just a tad. And I'd much rather be enjoying the party. I really need to unwind. Oh, you poor dear. I'll take over for you. Go have fun. I know I will. Taking one last look at the faces of the Baroque Works agents rapidly turning blue, Nami walked away. Sorry, Vivi. Better you than me. Now then, Kaya said sweetly, let's review the proper etiquette for being taken prisoner by pirates. Shall we? The screams could not be heard above the noise of the party. Zeph brought the loaded cracker up to his nose and breathed deeply. That done, he brought it to his mouth, where his highly trained and sensitive palate was flooded with salty, savory flavor. He chewed slowly and with consideration, until his saliva began to interfere with the flavor. After swallowing, he stroked his mustache, mentally reviewing every iota of the sensory experience. Finally, he let out a huff of defeat. Damn it, I still can't figure it out. What is that secret ingredient? Crocus smiled smugly. That dies with me. The two veterans were sitting to the side of all the hoopla, sharing a bowl of Crocus's special dip. So, Crocus spoke up. As the gatekeeper of the Grand Line, he met every pirate brave or foolish enough to tackle the world's most dangerous ocean. Some stuck out more than others. The captain, who was also the cook that insisted on making him a feast as a show of respect, had left a lasting good impression. I was surprised to see you again. Piracy is a young man's game. What convinced you to come along on this cockamamie voyage? Zeph snorted. Who you calling old? I've got another 100 years left in me at least. Besides, we're only as old as we feel, right? Taking another bite of the exquisite spread, Zeph sighed. In all seriousness, it was kind of decided for me. Brat managed to seduce all my men from under my nose. They probably would have jumped ship to follow him if I didn't agree to sail with him. And I figured between the three colors, a certain initial, mastery of the 6 powers, and a paramecia, enough bases were covered that it wouldn't be total suicide. Then I watched that green-haired one beat Dracula. Anyone who can make someone on that level defer to their will is probably worth following, don't you think? You don't say, Crocus mused. He glanced at the drinking swordsman. I thought that hat looked familiar. How'd someone like that wind up in East Blue with no one hearing of them? Zeph frowned. Believe me, I wonder that myself. There's something off about them. I even started to notice it with my blonde brat, but they don't seem to mean any ill, so I let it slide. Now that you mention it, the brat back from the dead seemed to know they were coming. And for the life of me I can't imagine how they could have ever met. Crocus snorted. Maybe they're all from the future where they were already a crew in the new world. Zeph snorted. Yeah, right. You're getting senile, flower eggplant. Crocus shrugged. Stranger things have happened. Crocus-san. The lighthouse keeper turned to see one of the pirates from this armada looking at him with confusion. He was wearing a very odd hat, with animal ears. Seriously, the things these kids wore nowadays. What is it? He asked gruffly. Well, you see, the kid sputtered. Captain Buggy recognized you. And you said you remember him from when you were on a ship and he was young. Yes, he drawled. He saw where this was going, but he got his kicks from drawing people out on a limb. The thing is, Captain Buggy was only on one other ship before he founded our crew. That's so, yes, and if you both know each other from that time, that would mean you were part of the crew on that ship too, right? I guess it does. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.